Hello and welcome everyone to the Capital Mind podcast. If you'd like to know more about us, visit capitalmind.in, and if you'd like to invest with us, do visit capitalmindwealth.com.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as the basis for investment decisions. Clients of Capital Mind may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Hi folks, this is Deepak Shenoy from the Capital Mind podcast, and we're here to welcome Krish Ashok, who, as I discovered today, is Ashok and not Krish. And Ashok is, of course, famous for many things. He's a musician. He is also a techie, and also has written a very interesting book called Masala Lab. So he's a foodie plus an author. The Masala Lab is about the science of cooking rather than the art and the smart and all the other things that you've come across. A very fascinating book, especially for me as an engineer, because it converts food into these things that is a formula that can be repeated. And I think that is brilliant. Thanks, Krish. Thanks, Ashok, for coming on the show. And, great to have you on the Capital Mind podcast.
Absolute pleasure.
So Ashok, I mean, I think it's been so interesting to read some parts of. I mean, you write on Mint as well. A lot of the things that you come across. What brought you, to this science of cooking part rather than? I mean, I keep thinking of this and saying almost like, why haven't I thought of this before? Why doesn't it's a chemical reaction? There's a Maillard reaction and a bunch of things. These are actually chemical reactions that, as a science person you should know. But I obviously had no idea until you explain it in those terms. It almost comes back saying, why didn't I know this? Why didn't I know this? Kind of thing. So how do you, for instance, describe the science, or what made you interested in it? And how much of it is an art versus being a science?
It's a question I often get asked, and I think it's a question that I actually asked myself when we did the sort of the premise of the book, when we first explored what should I write about, and we discussed with Penguin. It came as a surprise that nobody had actually written on the science of Indian cooking. So, commercially speaking, that seemed like a good opportunity. So I got lucky there, right? It ended up being the first book and therefore had that sort of natural advantage. But if I go back in time, the way it sort of goes back to my time growing up learning science and mathematics in school and realizing very early on that I really detested memorizing stuff and I was not good at it. And I detested practicing memorizing stuff as well. I even hated to learn multiplication tables, let alone some of these other things that you had to memorize, right? And obviously, Indian schooling tends to prepare you by getting you to memorize stuff because exams are a test of time. They're not really a test of, knowledge or analytical ability. It's a test of time. So from very early on, I've always been, my way of coping with the world was to always try and understand things from first principles, basic heuristics, and models and meta models, rather than let me just take a higher order understanding and just skip all of the foundational stuff underneath, right? And this essentially obviously ended up with me looking at the entire world, including even music, including everything else I do. A common question I get asked is, how do you manage to do so many different things? How do you play 4 different instruments and produce music, and then you do all of this cooking, you do all of this, you do art, and you do IT, you have a full-time job in IT, you do all of that. And then my answer often is that, no, it's not as complicated as it seems, because I'm effectively doing the same thing in every one of these things. The idea is to be what I call the strategically lazy engineer, right? So strategic laziness is essentially the kind of laziness where I will not do things that are hard manual labor. I will try and handpick things that are easily broken down into smaller modular bits. And each of which can be separately, you can master, you can automate, you can use tools, etc., etc. It's the same approach that I use in software engineering, same approach that I use in music. I don't play live music. I sit at home and I play all these instruments separately. I play them at my own free time, even when I have 10 minutes of time. And then 3 months later, the song will assemble itself, right? In that sense, rather than right? So it's the same approach. And when I started cooking at the age of about 13 or 14, my mother had a job in Canara Bank and she would often travel. And then that was, when she trusted the only child of hers who she trusted to not burn the kitchen down, in an LPG explosion. She said, fine, I will teach you how to cook. She had like 3 boys, so you can imagine how stressful it was. So very early in the day, I think when I was about 20, when I first went abroad, I said, look, let me go capture all of the recipes of my grandmothers, great-grandmothers, all the grandaunts, all the great cooks in the... And I would go to them and say, okay, tell me your recipes. And my understanding then was recipe was the modular unit of knowledge of cooking, right? And that, look, all I had to do was document enough recipes and then I'd be good to go. Many of the best cooks had trouble thinking in terms of recipes. So I would tell them, is it a quarter teaspoon of cardamom powder or is it half a teaspoon? And they would say, just smell, and when do you put it? Well, when this happens, and so on. Very early, I kind of realized that good cooks were, in a sense, not memorizing recipes, but really having a set of standard heuristics about when rice cooks, when wheat starch gelatinizes, when protein gets hard, or denatures, right? So when milk curdles, when fermentation is done, when physical changes happen, when something is dehydrated enough, right? And there's about 10 or 9 of these events, if you will, if you understand when and how, at what temperature, what pressure they happen, you really understand bulk of what cooking really means. The rest is just small details, right? Which you can then sort of, fill in the blanks, if you will, right? Understand certain ingredients work this way, plants work this way, animals work this way, and so on. And it kind of struck me that really speaking, that's the knowledge that should have been in our cooking books, right? Not the knowledge about the art and the history and the Mughals did this and, this, my grandmother cooked this and all the nostalgia and the history and culture. But really, nobody's capturing our grandmother's actual tacit knowledge, which in my sense, it's really engineering knowledge. It's heuristics. It's practical heuristics. It's not theoretical. It's not, they didn't study a physics or a chemistry textbook, but it's thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution and almost oral passing down of that knowledge about when something is done, when something is safe to eat, when something will not kill you by being undercooked and so on. This is actual tacit knowledge, and in a sense, so it struck me that since looks like nobody's written a book, I'm going to be the first to do this, and that's really how I kind of got into this. For the last 10 years, I'd been anyway writing down, making notes of, okay, today I used 50% hydration in my chapati, 70%, 80%, and this was fine, and this was not fine, and so on. So I had a lot of data, right? So I had a lot of these observations. And so on. So essentially, the book came together reasonably quickly in that sense. So it's the bigger difficulty was figuring out what to leave out rather than what to keep in, because of the commercial challenges of saying it has to be a 250-page, it can't be a 500-page textbook, it can't be an academic book, and it has to be small, it has to be paperback. Again, it was during the pandemic, couldn't be a hardbound edition either. So all of these considerations kind of went into making what this is. I'm hoping this is not the first or the last of these things. I hope many more authors start writing about their experiences, because this is really scratching the surface of the diversity of Indian cooking, right? And this is, obviously only covers the larger urban sort of middle class kind of cooking that we're used to, and so on. So that's how this book came to be.
No, this is actually quite, from a perspective of the person that made the book, it's like there isn't a formula. And the reason there isn't a formula is that because there are some very basic tenets to certain parts of cooking. And I think that's very interesting. Like you said, when something gelatinizes, the time periods matter. And even the crazy thing, right? So it's not the recipe. It's about, there isn't a fixed recipe. Is something that I, of course, if you ask me, it's like the Google map problem versus a person who is familiar with the city, right? The person who's familiar with the city will be like, dude, forget, I know where to go. I don't know how to do this. But the Google Maps person, like, listen, I need to know exactly when to take a left and exactly when to take a right. So that's the recipe person versus the, but if you get the concept, like for instance, I have a rule that if Google Maps tells me to go on a road that's less than 10 feet wide, I'm not going, just by experience. So even if I'm in a strange place, I will disregard what it says. And maybe those heuristics apply in cooking as well. It's like you could have a recipe, but if that stuff is burning too hot, you're going to change whatever you're doing, because you have to kind of,
Exactly. And if you don't know those basic heuristics, and you are actually going to end up learning the wrong things, actually, right? So.
And actually what you've covered is the science behind the heuristic, rather than, the old, there used to be a statement that said, there's this person who's trying to cook a turkey or a duck, I don't know which it was, and She said
Probably
you
a
have
turkey
to
is my guess, yes. Yeah.
you have to chop the legs off. And then she said, why do you have to chop the legs off? No, my mother told me that. And then go back to the grandmother and say, well, why did you chop the legs off a turkey before you put it in? And she said, well, no, you know what? My mother told me that. And the great grandmother was alive, and she went there and she said, why did you have to chop the turkey's legs off? And she said, well, because my oven was too small.
Exactly.
So, like, okay, that doesn't make it. So, it's like some of this is folklore, but some of it actually has. So the reasons why it applied at that time does no longer does.
So interesting. I think that's a great point to make, because a lot of the tacit knowledge, and if you apply a sort of typical engineering, sort of a scientific mindset to it and say, if I can replicate that in experiments and it works, then I know it works. And then I have to hypothesize why it works. Right? And that's where the modern understanding of, amino acids and proteins and these molecules and all of that is essentially knowledge of the last 200 years, right? But we've been cooking for thousands of years. And so it's not like that you need to know knowledge at a molecular level to be able to cook. You can still cook without all of that knowledge, and people happily do. In fact, the best cooks obviously probably don't know all of this stuff, right? But the interesting thing is that I found largely two kinds of this kind of knowledge. So tacit knowledge that has stood the test of time, they may not have had the molecular understanding or the physics understanding of why it works. And then once that explanation comes into play, you know what, everything makes sense, right? The second category of knowledge often is the kind of tacit knowledge where we have forgotten, like your oven example, that it came about in different circumstances, and our circumstances have changed, right? So very simple, obvious things. We have refrigerators today. You'd be surprised of the number of cooking do's and don'ts, particularly the don'ts, all make perfect sense in a world without refrigerators and packaged food and preservatives and so on, right? That is why a lot of the Ayurveda stuff about, don't mix milk and this, don't drink that fish along with this, all of that makes perfect sense in a world where things are rotting as you speak. The shelf life of any food is measured in minutes and hours, and how you combine stuff at room temperatures is very, very crucial, and how you eat and when you eat is very, very crucial. And so the problem is, people have a hard time letting those things go. And so that's again a very interesting sort of change that we're seeing in modern day India as well.
No, very, very interesting. In fact, I think let me go back to the science of it, and I think some part of this is now an overcomplication as well. So, for instance, the same way that people have maybe overcomplicated their financial lives, they've got bad products, they've got crappy insurance policies, taken on loans when they didn't know they were supposed to not take on a loan in the first place. I think what we've been learning, at least what I've been learning, and I'm on the heavier side of everything, is that the diet is what leads us more to be overweight than it is about exercise or perhaps stress. And there's lifestyle health problems that's just coming from consuming the wrong kind of food, or like you say, at the wrong time, in the wrong order, or however it is. So why would you say the modern food, if you may, and why would it be causing so much in terms of poor health outcomes? And maybe it's not right for me to say, because today we live longer than our ancestors, much longer, but possibly they were healthier while they were alive compared to where we are. And what do you think is the difference there?
So it's this is a really nice question, and I think whenever I actually give a talk about my book of food in general, right, it is 90% of the questions from the audience then not to be about how to make this tasty, which is what my focus is. 90% of the questions are about health and nutrition, and this is not surprising. It is something that people are worried about, clearly, right? And there's a second issue there as well, right? And that brings me to the caveat that I have to mention, that your listeners have to realize that I'm not an MBBS or an MD or a trained nutritionist or a dietitian, right? And so therefore, and again, we have an institutional lack of trust and science communication problem in India, where people do not want to trust a doctor or a dietitian's advice, scientific advice about food and health and modern diseases. And will sort of have a curious mix of conveniently believing Ayurveda when it suits their lifestyle, not believing it when it doesn't suit their lifestyle, and pick and choose whatever they want, right? So my first advice to all of your listeners, therefore, is to first and foremost realize that health and nutrition is a spectacularly complex subject. So we understand more about neurology and how the brain works today than we do about how digestion works, okay? About how gut microbiome health and obesity. These are actually very, very complex issues because our brains largely work the same way for everyone, but every one of our metabolisms is unique. And there are genetic components to it, right? So there is a certain aspect of it that is just genetic. If your grandfather had sort of got diabetes in his 50s, you're going to get it, and you have to be extraordinarily careful and so on, right? So having said all of those caveats, and obviously none of this is going to be health or nutrition advice, but let me sort of tell you the story of why we are in the state we are, right? Purely from a science history standpoint, right? So human beings are unique animals in the sense that we only the last 5,000 years, you can roughly, maybe 7,000 years, is what you can say is the time when we lived as a complex urban agricultural civilization. And the agricultural part is very important, okay? Because our diets prior to our domestication of grasses like rice and wheat and barley and millets and corn and so on was fundamentally different, right? And regardless of what the diet is, and again, it varied by part of the world. And again, people sometimes say crazy things like paleo diet. It's a stupid thing to say because every part of the world and every microbiome, the paleo diet was different. So if you were an ancient sort of Homo erectus living in the middle of the forest in Africa, you ate insects, you ate birds, you ate fruits. If you're living in the desert, you ate very different things. If you lived by the sea, you ate different things. If you're living in Canada, in what is today Canada, you hunted seals, and your diet was just literally only seals and whales and no plants of any kind. And those people, by the way, are perfectly healthy. They just eat saturated fat and protein and nothing else. No carbohydrates, right? So there's just so much spectacular diversity. And the funny thing is that all our genes and all the way our brains and our bodies work today is a product of almost that 2 million years of evolution when we were not an agricultural species. So we're still a pre-agricultural brain and body stuck in a post-agricultural society. Okay? And so a lot of the problems that we see today stem from the fact that our bodies are not suited to, first and foremost, abundance. Okay? Right? So it's not suited to the idea of eating 3 times a day. So prior to agriculture, people ate when they found food. And when they found food, they ate a lot. They did not skimp because there's no guarantee when you're going to get your next meal. Okay. And again, very crucially, carbohydrates were very, very rare. So the only time you got carbohydrates was when you were in a place that had fruiting trees that had edible fruits. The vast majority of fruits on all the plants are inedible. A tiny, tiny, tiny fraction are edible because remember, plants do not want you to eat them. When they want you to eat them, they make their fruits very delicious because they want you to, obviously, pollinate them, transfer the seed somewhere else and so on. So that's how biology works, right? So the only time you got fruits was during summer in a narrow window of time, right? And so the way our bodies have been designed is that we are addicted to sugar because those people who gorge themselves on fruits without, throwing up and so on, ended up surviving winter, right? Second thing, those human beings that ended up eating lots of fruits and putting on fat, right, ended up surviving winter better because winter was a time when you got nothing. You just had to live off your body fat. Today, we can't think of doing that. We immediately eat the moment we get a headache, okay? That headache is perfectly normal. People can now fast. Now decide to say that you can fast like for 2 or 3 days, right? But the interesting thing is that all of the body mechanisms that we know today are all inherited from that time. And now we live in a world, thanks to colonialism and slavery and sugar cultivation and all of that, sugar is now one of the cheapest things you can get. It's the cheapest calories you can get. Oils, fats are so easy to find, right? You don't have to hunt an animal to get the skin underneath it. You can just, go buy a gallon, 5 liters of oil on Amazon or whatever it is, right? We live in a time of plenty and our bodies are not suited for it, right? And so all our brains are wired to crave sugary foods and fatty foods, both of which were exceedingly rare. And now they're just exceedingly common and really cheap. And so I think in a sense, the modern diet is very interesting because the poorer you are, it turns out that the sugary, saturated fat, the sort of deep fried food is what is easily, cheaply makeable and it has the longer shelf life. So the poorest people in the world often have the worst diets right now. We have an interesting time. So you now, if you want to eat healthily, you have to be wealthy now. So that's the sort of very bizarre, wealthy people now can afford organic produce and so on, right? And so it's very interesting. If you really plot the curve, you have a category of poor people who probably eat healthy because they don't get much and they just get enough. And because they don't eat much, they're actually quite healthy, right? You watch somebody doing physical labor in any Indian city, you'll find them to be absolutely ripped, not very large, still stunted in that sense, but very little body fat. They're extraordinarily healthy in that sense. But then moment you get a little bit above, you probably find like chubby kids, a lot of overweight people and so on. And then when you get to ultra wealthy people, they're like eating, almond shakes and, soy something and, plant-based protein and all of that stuff. So we find ourselves in a time when our brains are not designed to deal with this level of addiction that presents itself, right? And so that's the challenge that we have, right? How do we, as a society, figure out a way for food companies to not pander to that particular addiction? So if we are able to say, smoking, cigarettes should come with a warning, right? Or that alcohol should come with a warning and some sort of regulation and taxation. There is no doubt in my mind that sugar and fats belong in that same, certain kinds of fats, certain level of fats, and definitely processed sugar and grains belong in that same category. But it's hard for us to accept that. And I think that's where we are today.
That's, it's fascinating because I think it's throws, like I keep telling it's surprising that at some point in time, if you had a butter naan or a butter roti, they would tell you the butter is bad for you, right? And now we're actually going to tell them that the roti and the naan are the ones that are bad. The butter is perfectly fine.
It's funny you say that. So I have had these top endocrinologists and nutritionists who have these very popular YouTube channels, Dr. Jamnadas and so on, right? He basically says that if you have a choice between eating a piece of white bread, right, and a croissant, the 1980s advice was eat the white bread and skip the croissant because croissant is just way too much butter. He says the modern day scientifically validated advice is go for the croissant because fats slow down insulin spikes, glucose spikes, because fats essentially slow down saturated fats slow down the rate at which your intestine pumps out the sugar, and that the rate at which your sugar is pumped into your system is what causes all these problems, metabolic syndromes and so on, and pre-diabetes and diabetes and so on, insulin sensitivity, blah blah blah, right? And he says that the more fats you eat along with your carbohydrates, the better. And by the way, since fats are high calorie, you're going to overall reduce the consumption. You should still be moderate about it. You can't like eat 10 croissants. Then you'll have other problems. But yes, so that's the funny thing, right? And this is what makes it hard for people to trust anyone, right? Because we all grew up being demonizing no butter, no ghee, right? To now, fry everything in coconut oil is now the new sort of mantra.
Yeah, no, it's actually quite fascinating because to me, from a perspective of a user rather than a, so I'm like you said, so I keep asking this. Okay, if carbs, if butter and all are so bad, then how come the French people are so fit? Maybe it's genetics, but more than that, I think it's just now there are some basics. Don't overeat. Eat at the right time, get some structure in the food you eat. So like you said, have more fats so that your body can slow down the consumption, and just the science of how your body processes food on the inside beyond the taste buds is quite fascinating because it can change, and it's person to person, but it can change how you you increase or decrease your body weight at different points. And over time, I think we do have a lot of complex issues that happen because should I have ice cream, which is possibly fat, but there's so much sugar in it that probably does enough damage from the sugar perspective of that.
Yes.
And so on. But coming to another part of things, I think I keep thinking of this and saying there are basics of food, and they're basics of finance. And many times people don't understand the very basics. So you rely on other people, which is like a salesperson with perhaps the wrong incentives, or you have other people with outdated knowledge who say, okay, only do this or buy gold or buy, so things like that. Sometimes your longer term financial success depends on some very basic parameters. Get certain things right, and we'll talk about this more later. But I think I'm wondering whether there's something very similar. I keep telling people, don't take on too much bad credit, do save yourself an emergency buffer, do a few things, right? Is there something like that, the fundamentals of food, the basics of food that you think people should be familiar with?
No, absolutely. I think it's a good way to think about this. So I would say the most ultra simplest one, that's probably oversimplifying it, but then we'll probably expand it a little bit, right? Is Michael Pollan's advice that you should eat food, mostly plants, not too much. Only three things. The only universal advice is eat food. Food is, he defines food as anything that it comes from directly from an animal or a plant or a fungi or something. Nothing that comes out of a packet. That's his definition of food. So if it comes out of a packet, it's not food, right? So, and also if your great grandmother does not recognize it as food, it's not food. So that's again, it's another sort of easier heuristic, if you will, right? With few exceptions, but largely that, right? Mostly plants. Mostly plants, again, obviously, I think it is good for the planet, etc., etc. I think other health issues associated with large consumption of long-term consumption of red meat and other things, right? So, and not to mention the issues with microplastics in the oceans and them ending up in fish, overfishing, etc., etc. Long story short, mostly plants, but of course you need good quality protein. Yes, occasionally meat, right? And then not too much, I think, is the most important thing, right? That essentially answers your ice cream question. By all means, eat an ice cream, just not too much. By all means, people who say, I will not eat this biscuit because it's made of maida, and instead eat a biscuit made of atta. This is useful advice if you ate 100 biscuits a day or 30 biscuits a day, which, by the way, you shouldn't, regardless of whether it's maida or atta. But if you're occasionally having a snack, then all you're eating is really terrible cardboardy tasting biscuit. And then, then you're not getting the joy of that. Then you're going to end up seeking more, craving more, and so on. So you might, when you eat it, don't have these random ideas. But so coming back to sort of the basics. So this is obviously once you eat food, right? Let me try and kind of figure out the basics of the entire process, right? So first and foremost, cooking is essentially the outsourcing of digestion. So it's essentially what it is, right? You are doing with heat and acids and other sort of physical damage that you do by chopping and so on, and other enzymatic reactions that get kicked off as a result of you doing that damage before you actually put it in your mouth. So that's essentially what cooking is, right? And this is a crucial way of understanding it, is because this is what makes us human. The fact that we're able to outsource digestion means that we spend a significantly smaller fraction of our energy towards digesting our food than a cow or something else, which spends 60-70%, right? And this is what gives us our massive brain and all the rest of the advantages of being a human, right? So when you therefore think about cooking as the outsourcing of digestion, you have to think about what goes into your food, right? So largely three things: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, right? Let's get some of the more surprising things out of the way. Fats are the one thing that incidentally do not undergo any chemical changes right till pretty much till they get to your intestine. Okay, fats are, well, famously very, very stable. Okay, and when you cook something in fats, the fats are not reacting with the food. It seems like it, but it's not. Fat is merely a replacement for water when you want to cook above temperatures of 100 Celsius, because water will evaporate. Sometimes when you need to cook something above 100 Celsius, you need to use a fat medium, right? In order to transfer heat evenly. Otherwise, you can just put the food directly on a metal pan, but surface contact is not perfect, and so on, right? So fats, again, very straightforward. You need a certain amount of fat in your diet because fats are essential. We can't make all of the essential fatty acids, and also many vitamins are fat soluble. And so therefore, the only way you're going to get them in is via consumption of fat, right? And so that's fats, right? And again, the question there is, should you use saturated, unsaturated, etc., etc.? Again, try and make sure that you're getting about 20% of your calories from fat. And within that, try and avoid, I would just say, things with trans fats, which increasingly nowadays are banned everywhere. Also avoid refined vegetables oil as much as possible and use cold press oils, but don't overheat them. But if you're frying puri, please don't use cold press oils because the cold press oils have a lot of other stuff that is not fat that will burn. But it adds to the taste of the food, right? So the extra virgin olive oil is what it is because of all the stuff that is not olive oil. Okay? So it gives the aroma and all of the stuff that's not part of olive oil. Okay. The moment you heat it, it is going to destroy all of those flavors anyway, and some of those things end up becoming carcinogenic and so on. So the occasional time when you want to fry puri, please always use sort of like a refined vegetable oil in that situation. Okay. And so on. As much as possible, use saturated fat. All saturated fats in moderation are perfectly fine. And I mean ghee, butter, as well as animal fat particularly, right? So you have chicken fat or any of these other fats that render out of, pork or any of these other animals. They're all of those are actually delicious fats in that sense. In moderation, they're actually fine. So fats, again, largely a cooking medium, so that nothing actually happens to them, right? You still have to store them in dark bottles. Please don't store fats in transparent glass bottles. That's why all packaging almost is always opaque. Even olive oil bottles come completely black in color because a light famously causes fats to sort of break up. Okay, so you want to do that, right? Next, we kind of come to carbohydrates, which is the elephant in the room. There are different kinds. You have grains which tend to be high glycemic index carbohydrates. Try and eat as much with fiber as much as you can rather than the ultra refined versions. Remember that something like a potato probably gets you more fiber than eating rice or atta or maida and so on, right? So don't demonize potatoes. Potatoes are actually really good, right? In that sense, and they're starch. So if you're eating a lot of potatoes, you might want to adjust for that. But in general, remember carbohydrates are mostly in the form of starches. It's better to eat them as starches than as sugars directly. As much as possible, avoid direct sugars. Because sugars are a lot of problems, cause all the problems that you do. You want to try and avoid. It's true. Starches ultimately get broken down to glucose. There's no doubt about that. But the problem is actually fructose. Fructose is present in white sugar. It's 50% glucose and 50% fructose. Starch is just mostly glucose. Milk is glucose and galactose. So these are all fine, right? The ones with fructose are fruits, honey, jaggery, white sugar. These are best consumed in moderation. So starches essentially need to be cooked in water, and then they will gelatinize. They'll absorb water. They grow bigger. That's why your potato grows bigger. Rice becomes bigger. Everything becomes bigger, right? So that starch gelatinization happens at about 70 Celsius. That's one basic thing you remember, right? So the next thing is proteins. Proteins are essentially very large, ultra complicated three-dimensional molecules, which undergo varying grades of change. The first level of change is that they lose their three-dimensional structure. That's called denaturing. Okay. So when they lose their three-dimensional structure, they become more two-dimensional. They're able to clump together and become more dense. That's why a translucent egg white becomes opaque the moment you heat it. That's why your chicken, when it sort of has a glossy finish, the moment you cook it, becomes opaque, right? And also becomes drier because the proteins are clumping together. So as long as you understand that proteins actually cook at a much lower temperature than vegetables. Very important heuristic is that try and cook vegetables and meat separately and then mix them. If you try and cook them together, either one will be overcooked or undercooked. So vegetables need a higher temperature to cook. Meat cooks at a lower temperature. In fact, red meat cooks at an even lower temperature, but it needs to cook for a longer time. So if you want beef or pork or mutton to be succulent, then you have to cook at a 55-60 Celsius temperature for 90 minutes rather than high temperature pressure cooker stuff, in which case you'll get something rubbery, which is what it is, right? So this is protein, right? And then remember that all spice flavors that add flavor to your food, okay, are all fat soluble. They are not water soluble. Okay, that is why all cooking begins by heating oil, and you put spices. The aim of that is to get all the essential oils from those spices into the fat. And then you can, for all intents and purposes, you can discard the rest of the spices, like, elaichi. There's no reason to keep them in at all. I hate it when biryani still have the pieces of elaichi and all of those kinds of things. Yeah, so all the flavors have already gone into the fat. You can actually remove them, right? You get them into the fat so they don't escape. These, remember, why do things smell good? Spices smell good because their molecules are volatile. Okay, so volatility also means that the longer you keep smelling good, it's also losing flavor. meaning that it's gone out of the food and into your nose, right? So what you actually want is to trap those flavors in the oil so that when you bite food and eat it, when you break down food, then the aroma goes back through your nose and that's when you smell it. And your brain plays a trick where makes it think that you're actually smelling with your mouth. Because if it makes you think that you're smelling with your nose, you'll choke. There's another, it has to prevent that, right? So it's a very fascinating thing. So remember that spice flavors, they get only into oil. So always remember that any spice powders you add them towards the end, not towards the start of the cooking process. Otherwise, you're just going to lose flavor, right? So a quarter teaspoon of cumin powder added at the end is the same as 1 teaspoon of cumin powder added at the beginning of the cooking process, especially powder. But if you're using the whole cumin, you might as well fry it in oil or fry it in the tadka that you add at the end, which is a good way of getting kind of that flavor, right? So these are just some of the basic sort of building blocks, but there's more. But yeah, this is probably a good starting point.
This is great because you suddenly realize that sometimes, like for instance, what I keep thinking is I've been doing a lot of this stuff wrong. For put the spices first and keep wondering why the spice flavor doesn't come. Especially like you said, if you can smell it, it's probably losing flavor fast. So you're it's better for it to be smelt when you stay in, and that the oil itself is not bad because. Sometimes you find dishes that are that have so much oil layer and you keep thinking, oh my god, there's so much oil in this stuff. That's not necessarily bad because it's probably keeping the flavor in the food in the first place.
It's a reason why restaurant food, people often find that, why can't I get the restaurant taste at home? It's very simple. More oil, more salt and more sugar. That's all there is to it. Okay. And if you amp up all three, you're going to get food that tastes like restaurants. But at home, we have trouble using that much oil. It's just instinctively, I think the way even the size of our spoons and everything else, we have a mental model that we want to be a lot more conservative at home. And so, so you can't quite get that taste. So let's be clear. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's quite, also, of course, they cook it in volumes that make a lot of the other things balanced. But you're right. It's also the fact that they don't shy away from, and I think you had this thing about how sugar and salt both compound the flavors. So it's more like if you have flavor level A, it'll be A++ if you just add salt.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And sugar. Because,
yes. See, again, evolutionary, right? So our tongues are the first sort of way of the salt and sweetness detectors are maximally concentrated at the tip of the tongue. That's the first thing you taste, right? And it's the immediate signal to the brain that whatever you're eating is high calorie. And the 200,000 year old Stone Age man is saying, brain is saying that, oh, by the way, I don't know when you're going to get food, but whatever you're eating right now is super high calorie. So eat lots of it. So let me give you an endorphin rush. Right? So that feeling of pleasure you get when you bite into a kaju katli or a sweet or a chocolate or whatever it is, or a savory snack for that matter, right? Is telling the brain that, oh, this is deep fried. This is high fat. This is high sugar. Fats, 9 calories per gram, right? Sugar, 4 calories per gram. By the way, our intestines can measure this, right? So they generate your intestine literally sort of lets you know when you're full by measuring the amount of calories that you've got. Okay. And sometimes what happens is that it only works when you're eating solid food because, so historically mankind has never had liquid calories, except milk is the only liquid calorie we got. And by the way, we normally got it only till we're about like a year old. Okay. Only then dairy farming happened and all of a sudden we had started having milk. Even then most adults were lactose intolerant and all that. As you age, you don't drink as much milk. But beverages, juices, your Coke and Pepsi and all those kinds of things, right? Where these are like 300 calories or a beer, like 300 calories in this one glass. Our bodies are not used to it. So they don't count calories. They're not able, they fail at it, right? And so they say, oh, I'm not getting enough. If anything, so they end up making you overeat. So that's what, in fact, a lot of these endocrinologists will say, the first thing you have to cut out is liquid calories. That's an easy thing to do. Just cut out anything liquid that has calories. So drink black tea, black coffee, black whatever it is, just water or salt lime soda and so on. Just avoid any liquid that has sugar in it, right? Is a good way of thinking about this.
Oh, nice. This is actually, this is great because I think getting the basics right is, like you said, in the end, if for instance, when you're cooking or you're eating, if you understand, I didn't know, for instance, even before this, that if you cooked vegetables separately and meat separately, you might actually get a different and more flavorful food. This is going to change a lot of things for me. This is very interesting. the problem is that you get used to a certain way of cooking. I've always done certain things in a certain way, and I've said, okay, there's a certain amount of oil, and I've tried to reduce that. And perhaps it's a bad thing to do, because, like you said, it's not all bad. I cook on a non-stick tawa for if I want to bake a certain kind of dosa or something. And one of the things that you wrote was, cast iron actually works much better. In fact, you shouldn't even clean the cast iron, because if you scrape it off, it's gonna
Not over clean it. Just
over clean it. Just a scrape off. Scrape off is fine, but I mean, if you scrub it out too much, you'll remove the layer of oils that have settled on it that make it non-stick over the longer term. This is so anti-me in the thought process that it seems like it's the same thing in finance. Like, people say invest in FD, invest in gold, invest in real estate. They stay with that because that's like their theory. And like you had said, there are things that have solved for a lot of these problems that you say. The reason why you cook in cast iron is perhaps this reason that other things leach onto the food. Like Teflon at certain temperatures leaches onto the food, and it's not good to have it. And but there is now this intermediate technology that says, well, you use an aluminum plus cast iron combination, and that's just as good. Probably non-stick right from the start. Don't have to temper it the way you do a cast iron pan. This has solved some of these problems, and somehow people aren't perhaps aware, and they're stick to their own ways. Your book has opened a lot of thought processes that said, well, you could fix this. But how do you generally break out of this rut of saying, I have been used to X, I need to change to go to Y?
I think it's a difficult problem, to be honest. And over time, I think the younger me would have generally told people, hey, look, you're wrong. This is what the science says. You should be with the times and so on. But as I grow older, I kind of realize that one is that food is something deeply personal to every individual, and not only that, and it's also very deeply personal to entire communities and their traditions and their history. Many religious and caste and community identities are based on what you eat and what you don't eat. And so people take food very seriously. And because they take food seriously, the mechanisms of preparation are taken very seriously. And again, I can understand that it all comes from a time when doing it wrong is the difference between life and death, right? You undercook chicken, you're dead from, salmonella poisoning. Okay. And so you over ferment something, you're going to be eating some pathogenic fungi or botulism and so on. So because of that kind of stakes, it's not surprising that people don't like changing what they have learned. And it is no scientist or some modern YouTube video is going to make you change something that your grandmother or your great grandmother told you. That's, I think, understandable. So in a sense, I think we have to approach this with a little bit of more empathy and say, first and foremost, that if you have to change your habits, don't change the ones that are in the sense that are not too bad for you. Meaning that, look, for example, if you're a bachelor, right, and you have a tough life and you're busy at work, but you still want to take the effort of trying to cook your own food, I will not say, please go get yourself one cast iron, one this, one that. All of that, I think, is too much for that person. It all has to be down to the circumstances. I would rather that person cook at home using a reasonably high quality Teflon. Okay, it's convenient, easy to clean, dead simple, nothing sticks to it, than order Swiggy 5 times a day. Okay. So it's really that. At the end of the day, I think, pick your battles, right? So in that sense. So I would rather say, don't break your head about what vessels you're cooking on. Honestly, I think that should be, in fact, the bigger impact you can make is if you can figure out some of these basic tricks that can make your food tastier, right? And also healthier. Meaning that, look, you can actually cut down on the carbohydrates, increase a little bit of the fats. You'll make your food tastier. And you'll enjoy what you're eating. You're far more likely to repeat doing that, and perhaps you'll invite friends over and cook for them and so on. I think that is focusing on that is perhaps a better way of making these changes than to try and change everything, right? Please use cast iron. Please don't use maida at all. I mean, these are all, I think, any rule that is hard to follow is not a habit that you can easily form. And if you want to form habits, I think it's better to keep the changes incremental and to try and work those habits into what you're already doing for the biggest bang for the buck rather than try to change everything, right? So that's what I would say to people. Don't overcomplicate it. You're not wrong in what you're doing. And if somebody tells you what you're doing is wrong, that's just arrogant, because we all eat food. We all enjoy the food we eat, right? Nobody should be telling us that the food you're eating is bad. That is just patently silly. Because as I said, I think one of the chapters in my book kind of talks about how you experience flavor, okay, is entirely unique to you, because the part of the brain that deals with flavor processing is a combination of tongue, which is all the tastes, nose, which is all the aromas, mouth feel, which is your nervous system in the mouth, with texture and all of that, crispness, non-crispness, viscosity, and all of that. Sound, the sound of a potato chip is an important component of the taste of a potato chip. That's why potato chips taste bad in flight, because of the ambient noise cutting down on the amount of crunch that you can hear because of the white noise, right? So if you wear a noise-canceling headphone in a plane while eating potato chips, it will be tastier. So, and so this is sort of, and by the way, you can't taste salty food very well inside flights as well, but that's why business class gives you, noise cancelling headphones. So people regularly say, oh, the food in business class is really good. They serve you literally the same food. Just it's plated slightly differently. But it's just that it's quieter, so you actually enjoy the food. And what it looks like, the colors, people associate browner, redder colors with certain tastes. They associate green colors with bitterness. They associate certain other colors with other flavors and so on. So it is just that when you have this kind of a multi-dimensional approach, the part of your brain that deals with this is the same part that deals with nostalgia and memories. Okay. And so what happens is that it's not just that you remember. So when you're eating dal, you remember not just all of this, but also who served it to you. Is it your grandmother? Was it summer holidays? What were the conditions? Were you tired? Were you just play a cricket match and came back to eat? All of that is part of your flavor memories. So no two people enjoy the same dish the same way. So when somebody says this dal is bad, all they are saying is this does not exactly match the circumstances in which I ate dal at my grandmother's place, is what they're saying. They're not actually saying the dal is objectively bad. Right? So all opinions on food are actually completely invalid. So they're all deeply personal, right? So, I often say that ignore all negative restaurant reviews. Only focus on the really earnestly written positive reviews. Because I know there's a lot of fake positive reviews also written. Try and figure out earnestly written, real positive reviews and ignore all negative reviews. So because the internet also, tends to incentivize negative reviews. So you might want to sort of account for that. So all that means is that because people take food so dead seriously, individually, personally, it's really hard to lecture people on food. And it is really, you have to say that, oh, here's what you're doing. Here's some small change you can make. And if that works for you, maybe you want to try something else. Hey, by the way, you should try cooking this dish with coconut oil. Hey, it'll be really tasty. And they say, oh, this is really nice. And then you tell them, wait, you know what? Coconut oil, saturated fat, not so bad after all, right? And then kind of explain to them that it's carbohydrates that are the problem and not fats and so on. I think, it's sort of, that I would say is how you get people out of the rut rather than try to make any drastic changes.
That's a great point. I mean, I think, like you said, also I remember this scene from Ratatouille, which is this. I since I had the kids went through this movie watching thing, I found that movie philosophically fascinating because anyone can cook and all that stuff that came in. But there was one particular scene over there where this guy makes a ratatouille, which is a vegetarian dish, which is a very traditional French dish. So when this guy, the critic, eats it, they immediately show him eating it when he was a kid and his mother used to make it for him. So that imagery is what. So if you can bring that imagery, that is the more important thing. And I think I found it fascinating. I come from the coastal part of Karnataka, and then we have a certain set of dishes which is very peculiar to even within the same area. A few places have different. So there's a dal, and the amount of the thickness of that dal is actually different from place to place. So if you make it thicker, there are people who were born in certain other places like Karkala and all that, who like the dal to be thicker, and there are other places who like it to be less thick. And this is dal with tadka, cooked in a traditional kind of Konkani style. But like you said, I mean, it's very interesting that kind of that is what brings you the flavor. And like you said, smell, food, taste, context, and even sight and sound that you're hearing at the same time. Fascinating. If you if you had to bring people out, I guess the idea would be bring them, make the people more healthy. It's just you want to get a similar taste, but you just want to use different ingredients to get that similar taste.
Yeah,
that may be
exactly.
the first way to kind of.
And also, I think in equal measure, in equal sense, if people realize that their own limitations of not liking something else is not because that something else is objectively bad. It's just that something else is unfamiliar. That's all, right? Yeah. So because I think there's a molecule called trimethylamine. If you are from coastal Karnataka, to you it's the smell of home. To a person in the conservative family in Mysore, it's a stinky smell, right? It's the smell of a fish market, right? Because trimethylamine is an extraordinarily smelly molecule that fish produces, right? So especially once the fish dies, as it breaks down, it's starting to produce that. So very, very fresh fish will not have it. But the moment it's a few hours after that, it's going to start smelling. That's the smell you get in the fish market, trimethylamine. It is, but if you grew up with it, and if you grew up with fish curry, if you grew up with that, then your memory remembers that smell as the smell of home, the smell of lunchtime. But if you grew up in a vegetarian household, that is one of the nastiest smells imaginable. Okay. And you can see, and this is not just about fish, right? You can even say this about mustard oil, right? So for people in South India having that sort of reaction to the pungency of mustard oil, and interestingly enough, North Indians, when we all had TCS training in Trivandrum for the first time in 1999, all of them coming to South India for the first time, and they're all like eating food that's largely cooked in coconut oil, and they literally threw up because they could not stand the smell of coconut oil, right? I think that's the thing, right? It's what is one person's memories of home is somebody else's completely nasty, unacceptable food. And if you recognize that, I think we'll probably be more sort of understanding and empathetic to what other people eat.
Yeah, I think I agree, because eternally you'll have fights like this on Twitter and all the time, right?
It's needless, right?
Yeah.
Does aloo belong in biryani?
Yeah, and that will never go away. But this brings me to another point about this feeling about what is good and what is bad, the evil part of things. Some part of, for instance, they say genetically modified cotton, genetically modified foods are bad because there is or that MSG is bad for you. And then recently I read that you'd written or that even tomatoes contain MSG, and then I'm like, hello, wait, nobody told me that. Where's that? Why isn't that like more popular? And it's the same thing that we see in the stock market. People tell you, stock market is gambling. Land, you should always buy. There's only so much land. God made so much land, and the rest of it, the people have to. The price can only go up. So I'm like, these are misconceptions that I can identify in the financial world. There are food misconceptions that I think you've talked about a bunch of them right now. But what are your takes on those food conceptions and biases and GM crops and all that stuff? That's the end of the world, not good for you.
Yeah. So it's sort of, I think I kind of briefly covered a big part of the answer in the previous question, which is that people tend to be skeptical of anything new when it comes to food. It's natural. To be skeptical is also natural. So I don't want to look down on people who are afraid. Yes, of course, we must seek to educate people when it kind of gets in the way of them preventing others from enjoying it, right? By saying, we must all ban MSG everywhere, I think is where there's a problem. By all means, you don't eat MSG, you don't eat whatever, yeah, you don't eat maida. But banning it for everyone, I think, is probably going a step too far. But yeah, I think, this is, so we've, interesting story of the tomato, okay? Tomatoes, we now consider to be very central to Indian cooking, did not arrive in India till the 16th century. The Portuguese brought it over from, the tomatoes are from Mexico, right? So chilies and tomatoes are natively from Mexico. The Europeans discovered this when after Columbus and so on reached the Americas, and they found the Aztecs and the locals eating this very interesting thing, and the Spanish brought it over to Spain, and from Spain, the Arab traders and others, and the Portuguese spread it everywhere, right? So there were no chilies anywhere in the world and tomatoes anywhere in the world before the 15th and 16th century. With tomatoes, it was particularly interesting because when tomatoes reached the Europe, they didn't quite know what to do with it, right? On the one hand, it belongs to a same family of trees and plants that are found in Europe called the nightshade, all of which are poisonous, okay? the deadly nightshade and all of that, right? So it's historically been used as a poison. So they were suspicious of the fruit, right? And the interesting thing is that in those days, the royal families used to use lead, pewter-based vessels, okay, to cook. Only now do we know that it's not a good idea to do that. And so they would cook tomatoes in that. And tomato is, again, European food did not have very acidic ingredients, except in situations where they use limes in the Mediterranean and all of that. They didn't use many acidic, sour ingredients, right? And tomatoes are obviously, sour. And the tomatoes would leach the lead into the food, okay? And so a bunch of European royalty died, not just some, a fair number of them died over a period, and they declared the tomato to be deadly poison, literally. It wasn't the tomato, it was actually the lead vessels, right? So for 200 years, people did not touch. And only in the 17th, 18th century, people realized science, they understood, tomatoes are not the problem. Then it started becoming a big thing in Italy. Now we associate tomatoes as being such an integral part of Italian food. It did not become a commonly cultivated crop in India till the late 19th century, 18th century actually. So in India, right? Only the 1890s or 1870s is when we started really having tomatoes being available, okay, to the Indian cooking. And yet you'll often find that people are suspicious of that, right, and so on. So in fact, Bengal, it's called Vilayati Begun. I think I may be pronouncing it wrong. It means foreign Bengal. Okay, so the same family, right? Solanum family. So the reason I'm telling this story is that many new things often undergo this kind of suspicion. And that's true of genetically modified crops. This was true of the hybrid crops that pulled India out of what is potentially, destructive famines in the post-independence with the Green Revolution, right? Every one of those crops, I forget the name, Norman Borlaug and others, the Green Revolution, right? M.S. Swaminathan in India and others. I mean, it literally saved millions of people from starvation, okay? Every one of those things were hybrid. Many of them would be considered genetically modified today. And I think it's just that how we need to educate people is to say that, look, we have been eating genetically modified crops since the dawn of mankind. The only difference is that either the genetic modification happens over 100-year period by artificial selection. So the farmer says, I'm going to pick this, I'm going to select only this, I'm going to and only grow this, and check for that trait, and I then grow that, right? And then I use pesticides and everything else to make sure, even if it's weak somewhere else, I want this. I want a large tomato. I don't want a bitter tomato. I want a large mango and all of that, right? So we've been doing this forever, right? The only difference is that you either do it in the field over 100 years or you do it in a lab over a few months, okay, with more precision, where you know exactly what change you're making. And you don't often have the other side effects that you have when you're doing random artificial selection in the field, right? So it's about precision versus again, I want to tell people that in the context of food, one of the most fraudulent words that you always have to be suspicious of is the word natural. Okay? The word natural has no meaning. It is a class distinction, right? It's a class distinction. It's a political term that people use to essentially other something that is unnatural. This is natural. Every time in history the word natural is used, nothing good has come of it. So some form, men, women marrying is natural, something else is unnatural. I mean, you just look at it. Oh, white people are natural, these people are unnatural. So it is just that, and the same thing applies. So when people say natural food, there is nothing natural about artificial selection and agriculture, right? And so on. So it's also that the same thing applies to genetically modified crops. I think it's safe to say that in the world that we're headed towards, with climate change now being a reality, that we have to live with potential catastrophic impacts. We're not going to meet the global the goals of temperature reduction and so on. We can't feed the planet without genetically modified crops. We better be able to get used to crops that can grow in flooded conditions, in utterly dry desert conditions. And if you think we have 100 years for people to figure out those varieties by pottering around using natural artificial selection, that's not going to work. So you're going to have to get used to things like that. MSG is an odd example. Actually, it's one of those things where one article written in the 1970s about somebody having a stomachache because they ate Chinese food was the source of a whole range of misinformation about how, and borderline racism about how, Asian food MSG is bad and so on, right? Most people don't understand that glutamic acid, which is the other part of monosodium glutamate, is an amino acid. And amino acids make up your body. So you have 2 kgs of glutamic acid in your body as we speak. Okay, they make up your muscles. So a sodium salt of an amino acid cannot be bad for you, at least in the kind of quantities that we're talking about, right? And the tomato example that I gave is that tomatoes have a lot of glutamic acid naturally, as does Parmesan cheese, as does lots of stuff that we eat, crustaceans, shrimp, and so on. The moment you add salt to tomatoes, if you wonder why they're so delicious when you salt tomatoes, is because you're producing MSG effectively, right? Because the sodium is meeting the glutamic acid, and you're getting glutamate ions, right? And likewise, I think it's quite interesting that the most common condiment in the world is tomato sauce. Why do you think so? It's literally MSG. That's really all there is to it. It's rich in MSG. It's salty, it's tomato, it's MSG, right? But people have a problem with like a quarter teaspoon of Ajinomoto. It's really about, awareness more than anything else.
It's actually quite fascinating. I think the more I read about it, more I hear about it. It's like you're eliminating these long-standing feelings or thought processes that have I used to always call up when we were ordering for the kids. You'd call up a Chinese person and said noodles but no MSG. And then I don't think they cared. Okay, I thought, dude, these guys have no idea. I was just putting MSG. It doesn't matter. But so I mean, in a way, cooking well doesn't need, like you said, degree. You don't need to have a degree or like a food scientist or something like that. And you don't need a finance degree to invest well. I did not have a finance degree myself till a few months ago. The problem really is that the knowledge base that we are seeing in the finance world and perhaps in the cooking world as well is that the challenge, at least from a finance world, that I am seeing is that how do you make it accessible? How do you make it more easily understandable to everybody else? But what do you think about like the stuff that you just talked about, like, and maybe perhaps what you mentioned earlier was we need to have many more books or many more things written on this topic about Indian cooking per se, because I think the Western cooking, there's a lot of literature already. But what's the best way to make the kind of cooking and improvements accessible to more people than where we are today?
I think people are often intimidated by the fact that cooking just seems complicated and recipes seem complicated. And so everyone who's a newbie kind of believes that they have to follow it down to the letter of every recipe. And recipes tend to be needlessly complicated, and they needlessly give you steps that in many situations, if you're a seasoned cook, you'd skip many of them, right? In fact, I think, I remember speaking to another person who's also a chef. And they basically say that, look, with fellow chefs, they can share a recipe in what used to be a 140 character tweet. That's all the information. And because the chef can fill in all of the other stuff, they just need to say core ingredients, what action are you taking, etc., and what texture are you looking for, and that's really so you can literally you don't need pages and pages of recipes at all, right? Over time. So I think my first message to most people is to say, first and foremost, cook regularly. That's the first thing. And 2, don't sweat it. In the beginning, maybe you want to get your hands wet by following recipes. It's fine, but don't worry about it. Over time, always try and eliminate steps and eliminate ingredients and see if it still works fine, right? And then once you do that, you'll learn that can you replace ingredients, right? And then you'll understand that, by the way, squeezing lime juice is literally exact same thing as adding a few drops of vinegar. It has the same effect on the food, okay? Because all acids are ultimately sour, okay? It's the same thing as adding a little bit of tamarind juice. Sourness is sourness, amchur. So acids. So the acid chapter essentially says that all acids are replaceable. So you can make rasam without tamarind and just use vinegar. So in fact, my mother said, no way. I mean, I can smell vinegar. It will taste different and so on. I said, okay, fine. Let me do a blind taste test. I'm going to make one of these days. I'm going to make rasam with apple cider vinegar, and you won't know it. And sure as hell, she did not. And she's someone who's been cooking for 50 years now, right? And so the thing is that once you recognize that and think about it, who wants to sit and make sure that your lemons are, they go bad in the fridge, they grow, they become brown, they become spotty, etc. But a bottle of vinegar will last for years, right? And if you're a bachelor, you want to keep a bottle of vinegar rather than sit around pottering around keeping lemons, perishable stuff in your fridge. You want to reduce the number of perishable things and waste, right, as well, right? So it's just that you can figure out what you can replace things with. If you don't have something, you can replace, with something else, right? And then you can kind of then figure out what are the things that you can do to change or fix something that hasn't gone the way you like it, right? So what are those heuristics? Overcooked, what do? I add fat, dehydrate it a bit so it gets brown, so it gets tasty, right? If it's undercooked, I can always overcook. If it's oversalted, I can add more water. If it is too sour, I can add sugar. If it is too bitter, I can add acid. So there are all of these kind of heuristics that you can then figure out how you can improve, change, and alter as you go along, right? So I often say that the difference between software engineering and real engineering is that software engineering comes with an undo button. Real engineering, does not, right? And in a sense, I think cooking is interesting. It kind of gives you a partial undo button. And I think that's what made it attractive to me, right? If it was like civil engineering, I don't think I would have liked. Baking is like civil engineering. You get one shot and you miss it. Once it goes into the oven, there is no undo button. And if you haven't got the proportions right, your cake will be bad. Your piece of bread will be bad, right? But cooking is some heuristics you can sort of. So I think ultimately experimentation, playing around is really what I think people should do rather than really get worked up about authenticity and all that. I would just say ignore anything that says authentic. Okay? There's no such thing as authentic anything. Okay. You said the dal in one part of that your South Karnataka is going to be different from another village, right? And those people will say this is authentic, these people will say this is authentic. The right answer is both are authentic to the people who are familiar with that taste, right? It doesn't really matter. Right? What is an authentic biryani? There's one every street here. So I think that's the way to think about it.
This is actually great. I mean, this because I think as a person I have not tried it before, and I think my next question was where do I get started? I think you already kind of answered that from that perspective of saying just go with it and figure it out. But, to be honest, this is how finance worked for me. I didn't come in with a degree, so I had to learn everything from first principle. So learning cooking from first principle sounds more attractive than just following recipes blindly. And because I guess one of the problems that I'm having, and I'll kind of end with this question, which is more of this. There is this Swiggy, Zomato sort of culture where you just say, just order, it'll come, it'll kind of do these things. And of course, then there's the cook yourself, which is a little more intense, but it helps you probably customize your diet to a much more granular way. Does this change cooking, this Swiggy? Does it make things healthier? And there hasn't been, like you said in your book, that, or I think in one of the articles, that India doesn't really have a restaurant culture. So
not till very recently.
Very recently. And then suddenly now, is this Swiggy changing that? Is that, or is it?
Yeah. It is very much is. I think on the one hand, I want to say that, I'm sitting here privileged, 40 plus, and, I have the ability to, hire people to help and, have enough time. I can order the people who report me to do work while I can go sit and cook in the kitchen effectively, right? In a way that I don't want to judge anyone who does not have the time and therefore simply just orders food out. I would just say that I think one of the things that's happened during the pandemic is the growth of more sort of cloud kitchens and home-based kitchens that are able to scale to deliver home-cooked food, if you will, via Dunzo, Swiggy, and these kinds of things, as opposed to purely restaurant-style food, right? Not always an industrial kitchen. If you can, my only advice would be for people to mix and match. By all means, eat restaurant food, if you will, once or twice a week, no problems. But try and see if you can perhaps find a local caterer or local home kitchen person who's delivering food. I think your health outcomes will be a lot better if you kind of mix and match that, right? Because remember that, restaurant business is a tough business. Okay, it's a extraordinarily high risk business, and then if you don't have the volumes, I think the rate at which restaurants fail is just so high. So what restaurants have to do to keep you hooked is basically exploit your 200,000-year-old Stone Age brain of really saying craving salty foods, craving sweet foods, and craving high-fat foods. And so restaurants really dial these three knobs up to 11 in everything that they do. And that's how, if they did not do that, unconsciously, you're just going to say, no, this dal was not very tasty. And you're going to order from another restaurant where it is swimming in oil because that's going to be delicious, right? And it's just the way it works, right? So it's just, I'm not blaming them. So I would just say, I think definitely eating restaurant food every day is not going to be great, right? I think Indians particularly have among the highest per capita consumption of salt. I think the Japanese are the highest because of their soy sauce being in everything. But Indians are one of the second or third highest consumption of salt per capita, way above what we should be eating daily. Okay, so and I think it's easier to cut down sugar, very, very hard to cut down on salt, because you eat less salty food, you just won't enjoy food at all. I know there are alternatives like mix of sodium chloride and potassium chloride now. That's called ultra light or super light salt and all of that. It doesn't quite taste the same. Doesn't taste very great, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, you don't want to get to the point where hypertension and you're forced to use those kinds of things. So I think it's better to be a lot more, eat the kind of, always eat textured food. So if food is like dal or khichdi consistency, you will want more salt in it because you want more flavor in it. Because you want to account for the fact that texture is like baby food texture. Okay, if you eat food that is mix of raw, cooked, crispy, crunchy, baked, that textural variation automatically makes you enjoy the other things, and you'll overlook the fact that it may not be overly salty. So part of the reason why salads sometimes work is the fact that they have all these other textures. A good salad has all these other textures, so you can get away with a relatively small amount of salt. Right. And I think, that's what I would say to people too. Sort of mix it up, eat diversity. Don't eat from the same place every day. And make a conscious attempt to eat a whole bunch of different vegetables, different kinds of meat. Don't eat the same chicken, eat red meat, eat fish, eat eggs, eat other plant protein. I mean, mix it up a bit. I think, that's the way to think about it.
Yeah, great. I mean, this is fantastic. I can't tell you how many things I'll have to probably, if I had a notebook, I'd probably write down 40 things that I have to change. Or I have to do things better. It's a good thing. And I'll pause there. And this is a very interesting format because Ashok's looking at Ask, and we had a chat on Twitter about this, which was let's do a basic explainer on food, which of course Ashok is the big boss here. And he wanted to know a little bit about finance. So whatever I know, I would love to answer. So go for it, Ashok. I think you're
Absolutely.
the guy.
This is the one conversation I've been wanting to have, for like ages, since as long as we've known each other on Twitter. So this is a great opportunity. And so let me dive straight into it, right? So I grew up in a family, and I suspect I'm not the only one. This is fairly common amongst particular sort of many parts of India, that we have an unhealthy relationship to money. As long as I've known it, since my grandfather and mothers and fathers, we never spoke about money at home. Money was always a hush thing affair. They never spoke about money to their children. I did not get pocket money because they felt it would corrupt people. It was all those, in retrospect, all bad ideas. But in a sense, let me just say that I got into a job with ultimately a very unhealthy relationship with money, saying that as long as I'm getting my salary, I'm just, I have enough money to spend, I'm not going to pay attention to it. I'm not somehow shy about spending time thinking about money also, right? So I have a feeling that I'm not the only one. And I suspect a lot of people have that kind of mindset. And I'm certain it obviously comes with a certain level of privilege as well, not having to worry about it in that sense. But how does first philosophical question is, how does one build a healthy relationship with money without necessarily being obsessed with it, go to the other extreme as well?
Ashok, the problem really in what I've seen in most cases is, and this happens even in my household, I didn't grow up with a very healthy relationship with money myself. And my father was a banker, and he was also in Canara Bank. That's something we kind of share, parents going to the... But interestingly, even then, it was considered taboo to talk about certain things, money. I didn't, for instance, know whether we had or did not have money. There were certain things that we wouldn't do because it was expensive. But I was always this funda of saying, listen, I don't even, and anything that cost anything more than a certain amount of money, I would be like, no, that's just overindulgent. I won't do this and all that. And like you said, I think it's a very different, there's one side uh, which wants to keep their family outside of this purview of money, talking about money at all. And then there is another degree of unhealthy relationship where they talk only about money, where families and we've seen this all the time. People transition between both unhealthy modes. You find families that don't talk about money at all. Eventually, people start fighting about money, and very relatively small. I know families where there are certain members who are really in need of money, poor, and maybe for whatever reason life's dealt them a bad hand, and their own siblings who are well settled are now fighting with two camps about who inherits their parents' property. And obviously, one side needs it more than the other, but the other side doesn't want to give up its rights. And I feel this unhealthy relationship is because, you haven't figured out what's worth fighting for and what's not. It becomes this. There was this book called Lexus and the Olive Tree. It was written by Tim, I forget his name. He wrote about globalization earlier. And the idea of the Lexus was this. He wrote about this book, and it's a very fascinating book. He says the olive tree represents these two people who have an olive tree, one person who has an olive tree right at the border of his land, and the neighbor in whose land the olives fall because the tree has branches which have reached his land. So who does the olive belong to? They keep fighting about this. And when you fight about this over long periods of time, you kind of reach a point where you're fighting unnecessarily. It's like you just might as well like kind of share or whatever and all that stuff. It's a battle that you has no rationality. Whereas the Lexus is the exact opposite. This guy went to the factory that made Lexus, and he talked about how in the Lexus factory they had this. The beading that goes around the windshield of a car. That windshield was rubber that would come from a hose, and that would be kind of leaked in, so that it wasn't like a standard made thing. It was actually kind of put in place. So this robotic arm would come and put that entire rubber sealant, and then when it moved back up for the car to move forward, when you have some rubber comes out of a hose, there'll be a little bubble at the end of it, and that'll harden, and then that'll make things bad for the next car that comes in line. So there would be a little thread that would come and just chop off that little bubble that had formed at the end of this exercise. And he said, dude, this is the extreme where they've built robots that do all of this other stuff. This is the exact opposite of the olive tree, right? So you've got unhealthy relationships with money that are mostly like olive tree format. So where you have very traditional thought process where things aren't this thing. The more healthy relationship is talk about what money can do for you. The biggest thing to learn, I think, and we have to teach our generation that, and perhaps the next generation as well, is that money is the only purpose that money has in life is to be spent. That is, you either spend it now or you spend it later. And when you spend it later, you call it investment or saving or whatever it is. And that the objective is not to earn money. The objective is to use money to spend on something that, you can give it away, you can spend it, you can buy yourself things that you like, but whatever it is consumption that you build. I think the bigger aspect of this is to not get very threatened by it. Don't think of it as something that will that should be. It's like it's like clothes. You can be overly obsessed about clothes, but at some level, it just performs a basic function of saying, "Listen, I need to look better than I am, and I need to ensure that certain part of my body is covered." So beyond that, you can take it to any extreme. And the same thing with money. You could use it for the basics and then say, listen, when I have the basics done, I don't care about a lot more than that, and then continue to live your life. Or you could obsess about it, say I want to make more and more and more and more, and then use that more and more to do different things in life. I think the biggest thing about money is you stop getting intimidated by it, and to accept it as an essential part of life, like food, water, clothing, shelter, and like you've said, I think earlier, it used to be that you had to be healthy to be wealthy. So you, because otherwise, but at some point now you need to be wealthy to be healthy. So maybe if that's your objective, then getting wealthy is just the journey towards getting healthy. And maybe that's the, if we told our generation that, or the next generation that use it as a conduit to do great things, and it's not a great thing just earning the money in itself. I think that would go a longer way in, and I know it's a philosophical answer, not very particularly actionable, but my kids, and kids get this, right? If you tell them 10,000 rupees, they're like, huh, but they'll think of it as 3 Legos or two, that is a different, so that makes sense. That's what 10,000 rupees actually means. But for you and me, it's like 10,000 rupees. 10,000 rupees is less than 15,000 rupees, but greater than 5,000 rupees. We're actually, our relationship with money is relative to what the absolute number sounds, rather than
I was saying it's a fraction of monthly salary. What percentage of it is, and so on. Right?
And so on. So we don't think of it as nowadays, unfortunately, probably 1 tank full or 1.5 tank full of petrol, but we don't think of it as that anymore. We think of it as the absolute number. So kaun banega crorepati is important for the crore number rather than what that crore can give you. Today a crore can give you probably X, but it can give somebody like 10x satisfaction, because for them that crore will change their life, and for you it may not. And but the kaun banega crorepati is exciting to everybody because of the word crore, and that's the unhealthy part of it. We obsess about what the number is rather than what it is.
The pati part of the I guess that's it. Yes. I think that was I think that was super insightful, and I particularly kind of I find it interesting having lived both in the US as well as here. And it struck me, and I've been part of so many of these, weddings within the family and all of that. And I find I find the way people think about money, even when it comes to a wedding, in such an unhealthy and dysfunctional fashion, as if it's like somehow it's a bad word. And it to me now, it seems like I think people ought to be thinking seriously about prenuptial financial agreements, and not just assume it's some sort of gentleman's handshake. Because come on, at the end of the day, let's say something bad happens, you go through a divorce and all of that, and it just whole thing becomes a mess, and you never really agree to how you're going to take care of this, who's going to inherit what and all of that. I think hopefully maybe, people are building a better relationship now, but clearly I think I hope people don't heed your advice and really see money for what it is. It's merely it's a medium of exchange that really, either you spend now or you spend later, right? And if you don't have a sense of what you're going to spend it on later, even if it means something as simple as, fine, I'm going to give it to my children for them to spend on. I think, it's better to have that clarity rather than, treat it as some kind of a ghost, if you will. So that sort of brings me to a second question. And I think and having, I guess when I got into my job around at the time when internet was in its early stages, you couldn't Google stuff. Google was still about 6 or 7 years away. But, it's quite fascinating. I recently taught a small sort of session, did a session at my son's school for class 8 and 9, kids, high school science, physics, chemistry, and biology, but explained those concepts by making them observe stuff that happens in the school kitchen, right? So, rice is cooking. Hey, by the way, this is how heat gets transferred via metal. Why do metals get hotter than some other substances? Because they have far more atoms close together. And when those atoms have heat, they vibrate, and each of them vibrates, hits the other, and heat transfers more faster than in other materials where the structure of the atoms is not quite the same. And so it kind of brought to life many of those ideas that otherwise are very presented in a very sterile kind of fashion. And it kind of struck me about why we do not teach basic financial literacy in school, right? And I sincerely wish we do. But again, how should an adult go about learning basics? There's no dearth of websites that seek to teach you, here are the basics of finance, here's the basics of all of this and so on. and every single one of them still kind of either presumes some level of advanced knowledge or has a other motivation of either selling you some products, and therefore are biased content in some shape or form, or in many cases some of the really good content deals with stuff in the United States or in the West and not really with India, right? And that is also there. I think in general I find pedagogy to be a stronger suit in the West than in India. People can call me anti-national, but that's what it is. We have very poor teachers for all the or all the guru worship we do. In general, we don't think hard about teaching. Let's just say that. So, you, as somebody whose podcast I've heard, and by the way, your book is on my read list. I haven't gotten to yet. But how should an adult go about learning the basics of this?
So this is actually a very critical thing, because the more I think about, I didn't learn about finance from school as a kid, and I think today when I started learning, they would there was this concept of calculate the amount of interest that a bank has to pay you on a fixed deposit, because money that was deposited up to the 10th of the month accrues interest for that month, and after that it doesn't, and withdrawals will remove. So this concept was removed from the RBI's calculation of interest rates a few years ago, maybe probably a couple of decades ago. So what I studied was wrong, except it was valid at that time. But that is a terrible way to kind of inoculate people or to inculcate this the thought process about money. How I learned about money was very fascinating. My father used to buy these shares of these companies, and as he grew older, like I am now, I have to wear glasses. He used to have to wear glasses to see. And Economic Times used to print these share prices of every stock, and because you didn't have the internet that day, you would get this in the morning of the day, and it was written in really tiny font in this yellow newspaper, and he'd be like, "Deepak, can you read this for me?" So I would start, you tell me, find this company and tell me what its price is. It would have some price and something in brackets, and I would read it out to him. And then I'd ask him, what does this mean? He's like, oh, this. Over time, I figured the prices move. And so I'm like, what does this do? He's like, no, I have. So I said, why aren't you asking me about this? You asked me about this yesterday. He said, but I sold it. He said, oh, did you? Then I would figure out that he would have sold something at a profit or at a loss. And, he would talk. The aspect of this that was fascinating was that it wasn't taught to you at all in school, that something like this is happening in a mega scale, where people could participate for, and see this on their prices on a daily basis, and you would be completely unaware. You were aware of politics to a very large extent. You were aware of religion. You were aware of Bollywood, but this finance thing you were not aware of, and you weren't made aware of it at all. I think. Unfortunately, because of that, when you grow up, you have to learn the hard way, which is you first get conned. Now, this is pretty much 90% of the universes. You get out, they sell you, you go to a bank or something like that, they sell you some really crappy product. You don't realize it. After some time, you're like, wait, this is a really horrible product. And then you start learning from the basics. But I say that three things. First of all, the very basics of this, and if you want to start learning from it, of course there's my book, there's a bunch of other books and all that stuff, but I'll go to the basic philosophy of this. You have to solve for three things only, and the first one is something I call hygiene. Now hygiene is basically, if shit happens, can I take care of myself and my family financially? When I say shit happens, you say, well, you want what if I have a medical issue, I have to go to hospital, it will go to cost X amount to take medical insurance. There's a certain way to take medical insurance, and you can go down that route. So there are a bunch of sites around how medical insurance works. One of the things that I tell people is that you may have, for instance, your job may provide you a certain amount of medical insurance. You may think that's enough. But what happens if you get fired or have to leave? You don't have any medical insurance cover after that. So you want to build yourself a personal medical insurance cover as well, beyond whatever is offered by your employer. And for those extreme times where you have a situation where people, you may be, for instance, in a situation where a single surgery costs you 25 or 30 lakhs. And that isn't easy to plan for. And getting a 25 or 30 lakh insurance is extremely expensive. You get something called a super top-up insurance, where the first 5 or 10 lakhs is paid by you. That means it's paid by your regular insurance. And the one beyond the 10 lakhs is paid by the super topper policy. Like this, there's a concept of arranging your medical insurance needs in a certain way that takes care of the simple part of what happens when shit happens to you in terms of medical health. And then there's life insurance, which is what happens if you die. If you have dependents, people that depend on you, whether it's your family or your parents, then you want to take care of them in case something happens to you, because your income source is no longer available to your family. You just buy yourself life insurance of a certain kind. If you go to buy life insurance from people, you got to learn that most of them are trying to sell it to you for commission. So the first thing that you have to do in this world, financial world, is trust no one. So therefore, you have to be a little bit more aware of what's happening. If the incentives on the other side, or the other side is getting paid commissions, then the chances are you're not getting sold the right kind of product in the first place. So if you're a little bit cynical on that front, you want to buy the cheapest and simplest product out there in general. Anything that adds complexity means commissions for somebody. For the most part, it's useful for people. It's like, to a certain extent saying, if I don't know how to drive a car, am I going to buy a very complex car which has 100 different dials, which is more, things, or I just want something to get me from place A to place B. So, well, a less expensive but nice looking car is probably good enough. Not the best of analogies, but I would say complexity is the enemy when it comes to this, at least from the perception of what you have to do for the basics. The third thing, and people often don't do this, is when you start saving, the first thing you have to do is build yourself an emergency buffer. An emergency buffer is simply saying 6 months of my expenses, I'm not taking salary, but expenses, should be in a bank account somewhere. It may not earn any return. You can invest it and keep it in a fixed deposit, the most boring thing to do in life. The idea being, if something happens to me, I have 6 months of runway. This is very important. Whether it is you're losing a job because, let us say, you were in an accident. Of course, your medical insurance covered all that stuff, but you had to not be able to get a job you got fired from a job because you couldn't go to work, and therefore lost 6 months of an earning. That's one thing. It could be a bad boss. You're a woman. Your boss behaved badly with you. You have to have the ability to say, I'm out of here. Because many people find that the power that other persons wield on them is the financial power to keep you down, and you want to get out of that dependency at the first point. So once you pass this barrier, the basics, you want to get into the next set, which is basically planning for your retirement, your kids' education goals. These are cash flow items that will come at a later point. Retirement is simply my concept of saying, can I stop working, stop earning an income, and have my money earn the amount I need to spend for the rest of my life? If you reach that point, and that point is calculatable, it's just mathematical to calculate, because if I'm spending 1 lakh a month today, with 5% inflation, I'll be spending 1 lakh 5 next year, 1 lakh 10 the year after that, and so on. So I can literally calculate what my expenses will be when I'm 90 years old. If I have a stream of cash flows that kind of gives me enough to meet that, and to get that stream of cash flows today, 1 lakh a month is 12 lakhs a year. 12 lakhs a year will require, at say, a 6% interest rate, 2 crores. But that will only work for the first year. What about inflation? So you factor in the inflation, you probably need 3 crores. So 3 or 4 crores. So the exact number is probably about 3.5 crores today if you're 45 years old, to be able to last you till you're 90. Now this is a calculation. We have a tool for this also. I'll put this in the show notes as well. But this is a simple way for you to calculate what you need. So roughly, I say 30 times your annual expenses if you are below 50 years old. 30 times your annual expenses is what you're going to need as a corpus to say, well, I can retire now without any issues. That means once you build this level, you're now working because you want to work, not because you need the money. You've reached that point, and that's a very significant point in anybody's life. especially if you're made to realize it. Many people have this money, they don't know it. And the minute you tell them this, they're suddenly like, wait, I can do this. And then, that gives you the ability to do it. It doesn't mean you have to, it means you can. Another aspect of this whole thing is that you plan for your kids' education. Similarly, the kids 10 years old, in 8 years, you might have to pay for undergrad. In 14 years, you might have to pay for postgrad. So you're sitting there thinking, I want to pay for these things. The only one thing I tell people is don't start paying for your kids' marriages, because you've given them an education. Your job is to educate them, and planning for their marriage is a waste of time, because they'll probably do the things in the way that you least expect them to or least want them to, which is, we did things our parents didn't want us to, and I'm sure our kids are going to be the same. But more importantly, you'll burden yourself with the planning and hurt yourself by saying, I have to plan for so much. I mean, marriages can go anywhere. Yeah? You've seen the number. They can go to 4 crores if you want, or 10 lakhs at the other end, or even 50,000 rupees. So, but once you get past these numbers, these are the numbers that you have to reach. The third and most important part is spend it. Spend the rest. Literally use the rest of the money to spend and enjoy yourself. Do you want to go, go see all the matches of IPL or the Indian World Cup in a different country? It's going to cost you maybe 15 or 20 lakhs, and you can save for it. The World Cup, I don't know when the next World Cup is. Probably 2024, right?
I think that's the T20
cricket.
World Cup is this year. Yeah.
This year.
Then I
Okay.
think 2 years. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, this
T20
year.
World Cup this year in Australia.
In Australia.
Later this year. Yeah.
So,
Yes.
it may be one of those times to go and say, well, I want to do this, except, COVID changes things. But other than that, it's, if you can't do it this year, you can plan it for 4 years later and save for that specific purpose. Or if you have this extra money, just do it because you don't need it. I think this is the basics. Beyond this is just, can I get you 7% on your money, or can I get you 8% on your money? This is useless as a thought process, because once you get these basics in, if I told you that, listen, the difference between 8% a year, and there was a quiz on Twitter on this, and I suddenly realized the difference. Somebody wanted to build a corpus of 1 crore. They were earning a fairly large amount of money, 1 crore in 5 years. So the answers that they were told was, you can invest a little bit in this large cap equity fund, and then mid cap equity fund, and something else, and you have to save 1.25 lakh rupees per month. And I did a couple of other calculations, and I said, listen, if you forget all this, and another person came up with another set. It was good stuff, but then I suddenly realized, if they just put it in a fixed deposit, they just need to save 1.45 lakhs. That means 1,45,000 versus 1,25,000. If you get this extra 20,000, you don't need the complexity, right? So people like me who keep talking stocks and shares and share market, and market is up and market is down, are useless. You just save 20,000 extra rupees per month, which is, for this person, may have been much more easily achievable than figuring out which equity fund and large cap and mid cap. That the reasoning of that is like, it's so because we want the best return. We want the best X. So if I got 12% and you got 14%, I am miserable. I don't understand. I mean, sometimes I don't know why, because we don't need to chase those returns. If we save a little extra, just save that a little. And in the book, I've actually given an example of one person that saves with a fixed deposit kind of an account, and one person who saves in this fancy account. The other person who saved a little bit more, all he did was save the same amount plus 10% every year. If all that person, the second person ended up with more money, even though he invested in a fixed deposit, the first person ended up with, lesser absolute money. So, and the difference is so small sometimes, you won't even notice it. Maybe 300, 400 rupees a month, which is like, I don't know what, one coffee nowadays. I don't even know how much coffee costs.
$300. Yes.
$300. There you go. That's one coffee plus a friend's coffee that you paid for. It's pretty much goes to negate a whole 4 or 5% extra return that the other person has got. So
wow, yeah.
I think this is the basics, and if you get some of these basics in place, beyond this is just fluff. We can talk about it. We can talk about, should I buy a ULIP or should I buy this thing? This is like grade 2. But it's like, as long as you have the basic insurance, which is, if I die, can you pay my family a lot of money? The same 3.5 crores that I should have right now, but I don't. Can I? So think of your retirement plan of retiring at the age of 60. Think of what would happen if I had to retire exactly today. How much money do I need to last the rest of my life? That is the answer to how much insurance do I need. It's just now a mathematical, subtract your savings. You need 3.5 crores. I have 1 crore of savings, so I need 2.5 crores of insurance. That's how you should look at it.
I think this is, I have learned more from this 5 to 7 minutes of your this thing than I have in decades of trying to talk to people to understand these things. I think you it's just this 7 minutes, I think, is probably worth for people to listen to this episode. That was really insightful. And actually, it's really interesting. You gave that example of the incentives that you have to understand from a life insurance agent, right? Because it's an agency-driven thing and a commission-driven thing, that what they want to sell you is not what's good for you, but what's good for them, right? I mean, it's and there's a very interesting parallel in the food world. People will often come and ask me, how should I order in restaurants? How do I look at a menu and figure out what to order, what will be good, right? Obviously, I can read reviews and do all of that, but everybody's experiences are unique. How do I know? How do I know what to order so that I can maximize my this thing? So there's some broad principles. Actually, there's a fantastic book called An Economist Gets Lunch by Tyler Cowen, which I think you should read. It's a fantastic. You will enjoy it. I think he's an economist and he really brings all those ideas into food, right? And he basically says that very simple. If the waiter pushes a dish on you, don't order it, because the waiter is pushing a dish because, one, it's already pre-made, it's ready, it's not being selling. And it's something that they can get to you quickly. And so that's what they're going to sell. And it probably has high margins because it probably has a couple of ingredients that they're able to overcharge you for and so on. So don't order the dishes that the waiter recommends to you. Right? So that's number one. Second interesting thing that he often said is that if you want to eat, often ask the chef, right, to cook it the way he would like it. And he says that sometimes if it's a really good fine dining restaurant, you can get the chef to do that, right? Off menu, he says that, and especially he says that when you're in the US or anywhere else and it's sort of a Cantonese restaurant or one of these other unique Mexican restaurants, right? They often have to simplify the food to cater to a bulk audience. You want to call the chef and say, I want to eat it the way you would cook for your family. And he says that sometimes that'll get you the best possible food, right? And then the other interesting thing is that he says that the best North Indian food in the US is found in restaurants that call themselves Pakistani food, not Indian food. Okay, and he says that most restaurants run by Pakistanis and Bangladeshis call themselves Indian food because they want to attract a wider, clientele. It's simple economics, and they want to avoid the negative connotations of being called Pakistani. Okay, so for a restaurant to call itself Pakistani and survive probably means that their food speaks for itself. So if you want great North Indian food, you want to go to a restaurant that calls itself Pakistani in the US. So it just sort of reminded me of that anecdote. So which kind of brings me to, I think you covered so many things in that, and I think some of my follow-up questions are kind of covered. But I think I want to sort of jump to this conversation about you spoke about how obviously you want to look at your money. Obviously first focus has to be emergency fund, taking care of your family. So therefore life insurance and all of that, then retirement goals and so on, the corpus that you need to retire and so on, then the remaining in insurance, education of kids and so on. You're right about, I think marriages are a waste of time. I think, our kid should probably going to tell my son to figure his own stuff out rather than, me planning and paying for it and so on. And then obviously spend the rest, which brings me to the next thing. So you get a salary and you plan for all of this. You're trying to put some sort of a SIP so that, things get out of your account at the start of the month, so that you don't end up having the sort of itching to sort of spend it elsewhere. But obviously, I think a critical component is that there is a hefty amount of tax that's deducted at source as income tax for any salaried professional, right? Now, as a moral, upright, upstanding citizen of India and so on, I believe I should pay my fair share and so on, and I do not want to complain about the fact that I have to pay income tax, but essentially, what I want to understand is that how should salaried professionals think about income tax, right? Let's look at it that way. I mean, what are the avenues that I should logically think about? How should I not overcomplicate my life, right? Even my own company, if I see all the ways I can save on TDS, I barely understand that menu. It's just 6 ATC, ATD, that this. I mean, it's just so complicated. National Savings Certificate, that this whole bunch of things. And now there's added complexity they've added for some COVID related, some in between things that I don't understand. So if I had to explain like I'm 10 in terms of, look, how should you think about income tax and don't complicate the rest? How would you explain it?
Oh, this is actually a very fascinating thing because as a salaried employee, you have to understand that you're at the bottom of the tax food chain. So what that means is you're a person who receives a salary where they deduct tax and then you get to spend the rest. That means you get. So I'll come to why that is interesting. But first, the answer to what happens to all this tax business. Now, the government has built all these tax saving mechanisms so that they can reduce your tax somewhat. They don't want to reduce it by a whole lot. So you make a lot of money, the relative saving you'll get from doing some of these things is too small for you to care. For instance, there is something called a NPS Tier 1 scheme. You can add 50,000 rupees extra to this per year and you can save tax on that. Now you're thinking, boss, how much will I save with 50,000 rupees if you put it in this NPS Tier 1, this thing? The answer is whatever you save from that 50,000 rupees, probably about 16 or 18,000 rupees per year. For this, if you have to scratch your head, the 1,500 rupees a month, it's not a big deal for someone who's earning 50 lakhs, 60 lakhs plus per year. It's a big deal for someone who's earning a lot lesser. But for someone who's earning a lot lesser, that 50,000 rupees is probably valuable enough to not save in the first place. In the sense, they might need the money in the first place. Because, so in the process of tax saving, are you then foregoing, I won't eat chicken for 10 days because I have to do ATC investment or something like that. That sounds like a silly thing to do. Also because of another thing, the tax law is complicated. It is complicated because it has come like it has happened with food. A lot of this stuff has come down through the ages, and because they can't just unwind all of these things all of a sudden, you have an ATC, you have a certain amount of standard deduction. By the end of this, you're calculating all of this, and by the way, you're paying for your son's education. You don't need to invest in insurance or ATC wala products at all, because if you're just paying for your son's education fees, it classifies as under that 1.5 lakh rupee limit where all of these things come. And if the same rule encompasses your EPF, which your company may be paying on your behalf to the EPFO, it's deducted from your salary anyway. So apart from that, there is your home loan. If you're paying your home loan back, there's a principal of that home loan. All of these get subsumed in the same thing. So only if you don't have any of these, that means your kids are old enough to or not, or you don't have kids, or you don't have a housing loan, or you paid it up, or your company doesn't have PF in the first place, is when you have to bother about this ATC limit. And remember how much it saves you is about 50,000 rupees a year. So someone who makes a few crores, it's probably useless to think about. But for someone who makes lesser, it's probably useful because it's a proportionally smaller amount. I think overall that the taxman will get you no matter what. The taxman has now started to change the rule. They said, listen, you want all this deduction and complexity? Fine. Up to 10 lakh rupees, you have 20%. Beyond 10 lakhs is 30%. You don't want all this complexity. Up to 15 lakhs is 20%. Up beyond 15 lakhs is 30%. I believe that they've already offered this to us, by the way. We know the reason we don't take it is because currently the deductions work in our favor. But if they change that 15 lakh rupee limit when you didn't take any deductions to say 25 lakhs tomorrow, say up to 25 lakhs, pay only 20% tax. No deductions, no bullshit, no thinking of NPS and doing some drama, none of that. Live your life aram se, just pay 20% on up to 25 lakhs. About 25 lakhs is 30%. It would make far more sense to do that as a salaried employee. Now, this is my opinion. If you're that, you know what the best advice would be? Don't be a salaried employee. Be a consultant. There is a reason for that, is because if you're a consultant, you get the money and then get to spend it before you pay taxes. You pay taxes on the rest. Now, as a consultant, you might say, what's the thing? I mean, you're paying for your electricity for your house you're working from home, and your electricity currently is paid from post-tax money. As a consultant, it is pre-tax. That means you can pay it and say it's a valid expense that I'm incurring in order to run my business. Part of your rent can be taken out, your vehicle's depreciation. You bought a 10 lakh rupee vehicle, it depreciates every year. That vehicle's depreciation can be taken out. After all that, whatever is left is what you pay tax on. In fact, if you created what is called a single person company, you will only pay 25% max, no matter how much money you make. You can make 50 crores, you'll pay only 25% in taxes. Because this law encourages us to start businesses. However, we personally want to be salaried because of a lot of things, ESOP, this, that and all that. But I think it's understated that we can actually be consultants and run personal businesses. And, there's another problem now if you have GST, for instance. But a lot of companies now, when they bill their customers, they charge GST. They get to offset that by paying you, and if you charge them GST as well, it costs you maybe 30 or 40,000 rupees per year. So, of course, it doesn't make sense to the person earning less than, say, 10 lakh or 15 lakh rupees to do this. But if you're earning a significantly higher amount of money, what you should actually be thinking of is getting into consultancy, moving yourself to a business, the higher part of the food chain, the tax food chain, if you may, where the tax food chain works very interestingly. If you're a salaried employee, you pay tax and then spend the money. If you're a business owner, a personal business owner, you will get to offset your expenses and then pay very high taxes, as much as 43%. If you're a personal business owner that is registered as a company, then your max tax rate suddenly becomes 25% and you still get to offset your expenses. If you invest in other people's businesses, let's say I invested in your business. Let's say you created a business and I gave you some money and bought shares in your company. After 2 years, if I sell them, I only taxed at 20%. This is the lower than even the 25% that so you invest in other people's businesses, it's actually taxed even lower. If I invested in a listed business, so today I buy the shares of a company that's listed, a Reliance or whatever, I after a year get taxed only 10%. So it's this food chain, where the tax food chain is basically a different layer. When you start earning your income from a business, whether you run it yourself or somebody else runs it and you participate passively, your taxes become lower and lower and lower. So your long-term ambitions is probably to get to the highest of this food chain. Eventually, your investments should be the ones paying you and you should be paying the least amount of tax on them. That, I think, is where you are. But as a salaried employee, they make us happy by giving these mathematical formulas. And we sit with our salary books and our ATC statements and keep saying, "Acha, we'll put some more here. I'll remove something from here." And then, in the end, it's just like, in casinos, they don't tell you that the odds are against you. Instead, they put an environment where, like Amit Verma had said, they put a lot of oxygen in the air. They don't put any clocks. There's no way for you to know day or night. And the music and the
free
chiming,
food and the booze.
And the booze, that keeps you going, right? This is the exact thing the taxman wants to do for you. He makes it so complicated for you to save taxes that you spend all your time doing that rather than thinking, maybe I just start a business, man. This is far better way to save taxes otherwise. I don't know if that answered your question, but...
No, it did. It very much did. I think if there's anything, I think it really, being part of the tech industry, I can clearly see the giant increase in attrition in the second year of the COVID pandemic as we kind of got out of it, right? The first year of COVID pandemic, attrition was like really low. Everybody was uncertain. And then all of a sudden, attrition just exploded, right? It's not surprising. I think a lot of the really talented techies are amongst the first groups of people to consider becoming freelancers. The really good ones are becoming freelancers and consultants, as you say, rather than work for a company, right? So I think
the problem is only that when you're a consultant, you're more easily fired than if you're a full-time employee.
That is true.
But
yes.
When you're in demand, when your skills are in demand, it's unlikely that you'll even if you get fired, you'll find something else.
And again, I think in many cases you're going to be working multiple gigs also. So it's also that, right? I think you control your time, and I think part of the fallacy of working for a large company is that somehow you need to spend 9 hours per day on that one problem according to a project plan forever, right? I think it's not how people work. I think people who can multitask are probably better off being individual consultants rather than be a single employee and so on. Yeah, I mean, I think I can see the logic in that. Super insightful. So, which kind of brings me to my next question about. I think you did mention this briefly about once you kind of work out the basics, you're also going to have to think about how do you make your money work for you, right? And again, that is in a sense, as once you've dealt with all of the complexities before, right? All the options for how to do emergency fund, FD, that insurance, various kinds of insurance, bad insurance, good insurance, useful health insurance, copay, and all those other risks and all the other agents and all the other nonsense that comes with it. Once you get past all of that, right? Then you have this universe of ways in which people will tell you that your money can make money for you, right? At the basic level, obviously putting stuff in an FD and just letting it earn a very modest amount of interest, and then you have obviously mutual funds and ULIPs and a whole bunch of these now increasingly complex derivative financial instruments that increasingly are harder and harder to understand, and so on. So how should someone simplify their mind about what heuristics should you keep in mind when you think about making money?
So, here's a very interesting way to look at the problem. I mean, very interesting for me when I first came about it. Okay, to a person who starts off looking at why should I earn more money? I mean, why should my money make more money? So why should I give you 100 and you give me 101? The obvious answer is inflation. So, if prices go up tomorrow, I need to be paid for that. So the 100 rupees today is not worth the same as 100 rupees tomorrow, because 100 rupees tomorrow will buy less than what it can buy today. Therefore, I want an increase. So your FD returns are just compensation for inflation for the most part. And after they take the taxes out, it is not even compensation for inflation. So at best, you're getting sub-inflation returns when you put money into an FD. So what happens therefore is you need a higher salary increase to cope with the fact that your current money is not earning enough, even as much as to make inflation. Now, why is inflation there in the first place? Is that prices of goods tend to go up when there's more supply, there's less supply and more demand. So more people are asking for the same thing, and therefore the prices are going up. Now, there are certain things where inflation is very low. And the reason I'm diverting into inflation is because this helps you set up parameter of what kind of returns you want in the first place. You have to calculate your personal layer of inflation. We did a podcast on this. If you're a person who's in the upper middle class today, in the sense of in economic criteria, the top 1%, the English speaker and all that stuff, your inflation is likely very different from what anybody else is seeing. If potato prices go up 30%, you probably won't even notice. The Swiggy restaurant you bought from probably won't even increase their rates for the most part, because their list price is so much higher than the cost of the ingredients that for them it's like, whatever, we'll absorb it. So they don't want to change our menus. So the higher end restaurants will probably not change their cost so much as a response to input prices. So your consumption basket doesn't change so much with food prices going up as it does with certain other things. If mobile phone prices were to go up, you might say, okay, there's inflation. You might say if the car prices go up, there's inflation. Education at higher end schools go up, it's inflation, and so on and so forth. This is a very different metric than what the government tells us. Your inflation may actually be 10 or 12% depending on your lifestyle. It may actually be much lesser. My wager is it is much lesser as an aspect, because the stuff we buy, the cars for instance, to about 25 years ago, I bought an entry level Maruti car for 2.5 lakhs. Today, an entry level Maruti car is probably 3.5 lakhs. 25 years, getting up to about 30 or 40% in 25 years is 1.5% inflation per year. Same thing would apply to a lot of other things. So if you look at inflation as a whole, your basket today of spending may not be significantly higher than what it was maybe 3, 5, 7 years ago. Other than the fact that, of course, kids need Lego costs more, etc., etc., etc. So there is that. The reason you want to factor inflation is the minimum return you want is inflation. That is what you want from your money to earn. So if you put 100 rupees out to save today, it should minimum give you the inflation that you need to make. Now, obviously, it has to make more than that. So how much more? Now, consider an economy has something called a real growth. the real growth, the concept is this. Okay, so if you had an economy with only 100 rupees and only Ashok making 100 widgets, you could only charge 1 rupee per widget because there's only 100 rupees to pay for it. So 1 rupee per widget is all you can do. But somehow Ashok decides that he tunes his factory, he does something, he makes 120 widgets. Now there's 120 widgets that have to be sold and only 100 rupees available to consume them. Automatically the price should fall to 80 paisa per. But when prices fall, the governments in this world have suddenly realized that, listen, if prices fall, people don't buy. They'll say, listen, Ashok, your price is going to go even lower tomorrow, so let me then, wait till I consume it. They don't even give you that 80 paisa, hoping that it will become 60 paisa per widget, and then they don't consume. So instead, what the RBI does is it prints money. It prints money, and therefore it prints another 20 rupees so that your price can remain the same. But because maybe demand is higher, you charge 1 rupee 25 paisa per this thing. Your 120 widgets now sell for 160 rupees, let us say, because the RBI has printed a little more. You're now making a real growth of 20%, which happened because you actually increased your productivity by 20%. You instead of 100 widgets, you're making 120 widgets. And there was a 25% price increase on your product. On 25%, 1 rupee became 1 rupee 25 paisa. 25% is inflation, 20% is real growth. So this real growth is what we calculate for the economy as a whole. Now, in general, the real economic growth has been between 5 and 8%. Last 2 years have been horrible, but roughly in India, it's been 5 to 8% in the last, say, 10, 15 years. That is another thing you want. Above inflation, I want 10 to 5, I want my 6% returns. So if I think of my inflation as 5% and my real growth is 6%, the minimum my investment should give me is 11%. Just to make, I'm part of the economy. Why shouldn't my money grow at the same time as the economy? Which is why when you invest in the stock market, it is supposed to grow at that economic, it's called the nominal economic growth, which includes real growth and inflation. So this is the kind of return you should expect from your investments in the long term if you aren't taking insane amounts of long-term risk. Now, the more risk you take, for instance, you and I could be both making widgets. I fine-tune my factory and I could make only 5 more widgets. Where I was making 100, now I'm making 105. You fine-tuned your factory and you made 150 widgets. You obviously deserve a higher return because now you're selling more widgets and all that stuff. I would hate, and the capitalistic society we reward people who become more productive, which is a good thing because that encourages you to produce even more and all that stuff. This is exactly what your money is also going to do. It's trying to go to play parts of society that are productive. So if you put money into the stock markets, that is going to take some risk because it's possible that in this fine-tuning of your widgets, your factory caught fire and you make nothing. So you have a risk as well of losing it. So if I invested in you, I could lose my money. Whereas if you took a loan from me, you would always have to pay me regardless of whether your factory burned down or not. You might still always have to pay me. And if I give you 100 rupees, you'll say, Deepak, I'll give you inflation-based returns, which is 5 or 6%. So I'll give you 6%, maybe 7%. So I can get 7% guaranteed from you, which is what a fixed deposit is, by taking lesser risk because you're a big guy and you'll pay me anyways. Like a bank is. You put your fixed deposit in a bank, you know that the bank has to pay you anyways, and if not, there's a government insurance backing it up to 5 lakh rupees and so on. So you get just inflation level returns if you invest in what is called what are fixed deposits. Now, the minute you start taking risk, the amount keeps increasing. It reaches a point where if you invest in equity, you should get economic returns broadly in the longer term. If you take even more risk, chances are now that you could lose your money or you could make a significantly higher return. Now, I'll give you one example where you can. When you invest in yourself, let's say you take a course today and that course allows you to get a job at 20% higher pay. That is effectively an investment that has given you 20% higher pay. But you know what? If you're getting paid 1 lakh rupees a month and you pay 50,000 rupees for this course and it increases your salary from 1 lakh to 1 lakh 20,000 rupees, your return on this investment of 50,000 is huge, right? Because in 1 year, you would have got 2 lakh 40,000 rupees extra Investing 50 and making 2,40,000 is the stuff of dreams. So investing in yourself is probably the highest return that you can get. But when you have money that needs to be deployed in some other thing, you can invest in other people's businesses. They will give you this 11% in the long term in equity. And now the point is, now how do you invest in these businesses? You can invest directly by finding which share, and but this thing you don't know, it's too much time consuming, it's a pain in the neck, and then somebody will throw your balance sheet at you, look at all the numbers and say, boss, my dog ate my homework, let me go home, I'll put it back in an FD. So it's complicated, and finance people like me, they love to make everything so complicated that so that in the end you come to us and say, Deepak, you know what, take my money, you do it. I think you understand the shit more than me. But it's not that complicated. So in reality, what it means is that if you have the inclination, the time, and perhaps a certain amount of mathematical skill, understanding this field is not complex. So you could go directly invest in companies, get yourself returns, and because you may not want to bet on one company because you have no idea what this fellow is going to do. Mukesh Ambani goes, he's got some liver problem, something happens, the stock tanks, you're sitting there saying, I only own his company, I don't own anything else. Now you're saying, no, I want to own TCS also, I want to own so bunch of stocks. When I do that, I create what is called a portfolio. I create a bunch of stocks and I own them. Now here some things can go wrong in some companies, but it will be offset by some things going right in the others. You have to track this over time. Sometimes you feel, I don't even know how to select these companies. Everybody's telling me, buy this, buy that. It's like that waiter who tells me food, mostly because he also owns the share and he wants to sell it to you. So he says, you buy. So because shares are complicated, they invented mutual funds. They said, boss, some mutual fund manager there, very smart guy, wears a suit, has degree from IIM. Therefore, give him money. It's mutual fund. And because mutual funds are complicated, some mutual funds will invest only in large cap equity stocks. Some will in mid cap equity stocks. Some will invest in large and mid cap. So they name them appropriately. And you say, well, find the right manager, give it to him. Over time, I'll just keep on saving my money. He'll somehow grow it over time. Now, this is another good way because you don't have the time to go down the stock level. A mutual fund it's also tax efficient, because if you invest in a company and then for some reason you have to sell it and invest in another company, if you do it yourself, you have to pay tax on the profits you made in the first sale. If a mutual fund manager does it for you, you don't have to pay any tax. So this is very interesting. You have to pay tax only when you sell your mutual fund. The mutual fund manager can keep buying and selling stocks, and that's fine. So this is interesting because this allows you to do these these tricks. So mutual funds are a little more tax and they're easier to understand because large cap means boss top X companies, somehow figure it out. Beyond this, there are something called index funds, saying boss, all these mutual fund managers are very smart and all, but you know what, all of them collectively have not even been able to beat the index. The index is something like a Nifty, which is the top 50 stocks. Why don't I just invest in the top 50 stocks? You have to pay 2% fees every year if I invest through a manager. If I don't invest through a manager, I have to pay 0.2% fees per year. So why don't I say, because 1.8% per year over 30-40 years is like 80-90%, which is a huge amount. So why don't I just go to the index instead? You go to the index, they're called index funds. You just need to know what they are. Once you know what they are, just keep putting money into them every month or over time and you'll get there. The problem with this is equity, and equity is risky because some foreign investor decides to pull out money. HDFC Bank is down 40% and nobody knows why. Now, you have lost 40% of your money, and maybe not 40% of all your money. It's just that the index itself has fallen a little bit, maybe 2% or 3%, but it's still not giving you this 11% economic return. The point about it is equity is volatile. It may give you this 11% return over a 10-year period. But over any 1-year period, you're likely to lose money. In a 2-year period, you're likely. As you increase the number of years of holding, the likelihood of losing money in an absolute basis reduces over time. Just don't tell this to any Japanese fellow because they'll throw chappals at you. They haven't, their stock market hasn't recovered since 1992. Okay, so this is one glaring exception over there. But by and large in India, you've not lost money if you've stayed invested 5 years plus. Now, the other part of this is then you can go more complicated. Once you get beyond this in the mutual funds, there's something called a hybrid mutual fund as well. So you say, oh boss, I don't want to take so much risk in equity. I'll put X amount in equity and a little more amount in what is called fixed income. So instead of giving a fixed deposit to a bank, you can give a fixed deposit to a corporate entity like a Shriram Transport Finance or something like that. Those mutual funds buy debt. I mean, they give loan money to these companies and get a slightly higher interest rate. Now, how do you know whether Shriram Transport Finance will pay back or not? Answer is you and I don't know. We have to have some relationship to understand whether they will or not, and therefore look at their balance sheets, etc. So for that expertise, you pay that mutual fund manager a little bit. Hybrid means investing a little bit in fixed income, little bit in stocks, and so on. My funda is that over time, if you have a long enough horizon, you want to be as much higher and higher into equity as possible. As you get closer to the point where you start needing the money, you want to get to a point where you have fixed income, because over short periods, this concept of getting economic growth returns does not happen. So if you're about 2 years away from your goal, you want to keep at least 60 to 70% of your money in fixed income, like a fixed deposit or a fixed income mutual fund or something like that. And as you get your 10 years to the goal, your chances are you can increase the equity exposure. It's entirely depending on when you need the money. If you don't need the money, even if you're 75 years old, if you don't need the money, you can be 75% in equity. There's no problem at all. Maybe you have some money stacked up, or you have written a book and that the royalties, I mean, for you, for instance, hopefully the royalties will be enough for you to never need money anymore, and it keeps coming every quarter.
Your estimation of the Indian publishing industry is way overrated.
I'm as much a victim as you are. So I'm throwing things around, hoping that everybody will buy our books. But even then, it could be, for instance, Michael Lewis, who's a famous financial author and sports author as well, wrote a book called Liar's Poker, and that got him enough money to buy a villa in San Francisco. I think, I don't remember where that was, but I mean that's really expensive area, or in the Bay Area or something like that. So it does happen, and the woman who wrote Harry Potter is reasonably rich, richer than the Queen, like they say. Yeah. But what I'm trying to say over here is there are other ways to make that long-term money, by writing books, by doing running a business. This is also another way for your money to make more money. It just needs more work. When you're passive, you give your money to an equity manager. You may be slightly active in terms of selecting a company and buying them. That's one thing. You could buy startups, your way into startups. Some of them have made really money. You could buy, and we'll talk about this later, other asset classes like crypto, gold, and all that stuff. Those are just other ways to make money. Gold has just held its value for a really long time. I don't believe it's a great value to hold. And especially if you're not planning for kids' marriages and all that, it's a waste to hold in any meaningful way. So it's better to just be like and within equity, you don't have to be just India. Right now, you can, as an Indian, invest in US companies as well. You could open an account abroad and put up to 2 crores a year per person in your family. Outside,
you would have to do this individually, or is that something that your mutual fund manager can do as well? Or
they used to be able to until a few weeks back, when there's a certain limit, $7 billion, when all the mutual funds have hit that limit collectively. No longer can a mutual fund take your money and invest abroad, but that's actually a better way because they know what they're doing, and so hopefully, but unfortunately that limit has been hit. So currently, as we speak, they're not accepting more money in those mutual funds. But when they do, there are better mechanisms. There are better ways for you to do it. Otherwise, right now, you have to open an account abroad and do it. So you could buy yourself a piece of Google, Apple, so on. You will get their supernormal growth by them listening into perhaps even this podcast while it's happening, and perhaps serve as ads later. But this is stuff that Indian companies don't do, because we sell coal and aluminum and steel and all that stuff for the most part. That's why those companies are on our indexes, and in their indexes it's Microsoft and Google and Apple and all that stuff. We'll evolve eventually to that point, but it'll probably take another 10-15 years. So your basis of everything is simply that I think you need to build your capacity to earn this economic return, not just inflation return. So you want to get economic return, then you have to take some risks. What I would generally say is most of your money should be in such stuff, which is larger stocks that are spread across diversified and some fixed income mutual funds to provide some security. whatever is left behind, maybe that 5 or 10%, you can play around with. And play around and flaunt and put on Twitter that you made 80% doing F and O and derivatives and all that stuff. But unless you're a master of that, you don't want to get in. It's like, in baking, there's this spun sugar made. I forget what that thing is. It's bloody insane. It is in my wife went through this for a long time, and she said it took them so long to figure out how to make the spun sugar piece that eventually it was like, if you got it right, you knew there was a 40% luck element in it, regardless of almost how skilled you are. I mean, or maybe she's not skilled enough to say that you could get it right every single time, but she was skilled enough to know that if I would even try doing this, I would get it wrong at least 99% of the times I did my first 100 attempts. So, but the point is the same, I think, here is that, you can be an expert at finance and earn a lot higher returns than this economic return. What I'm talking about, 10-11% can be 50% a year. But that just requires more expertise. And people aren't very fond of this stuff. Like you said, not everybody is fond of cooking, not everybody is fond of finance. These numbers are astoundingly boring. My son came to me once and said, Dad, he saw me looking at some Excel spreadsheet and said, Dad, if something happens to you, am I supposed to be working at Capital Mind? And I said, no. He's like, thank God, because this stuff is so boring. You may not have the inclination. I don't think you should think of this as stuff that I have to master. You can do the basics and get these broad economic returns. But I think temper your expectations. If you try to get much more than economic returns, the risk is hidden. So if somebody comes and tells you 20% guaranteed, and you know that economic returns are 11%, there is no guarantee. It's not the return on your money that you should be worried about. It's the return of your money that you should be worried about.
Absolutely. I think that's super insightful. I think it's you've kind of largely answered, I think, my next couple of questions. We'll sort of briefly touch upon that. But I think one anecdote I wanted to share is that I think your point about diversification, right, is this, again, so many parallels with food as well. People often, I think, miss the point when, for example, when they hyper focus on one ingredient and then say, I will not eat any sugar, I will only eat jaggery, which I think is patently silly. For starters, most people don't realize jaggery is, near 99% just sugar, okay? There is no difference. By all means, jaggery actually gives you a richer flavor in some desserts. So make a flavor stylistic choice by all means and eat that dessert in moderation. But if your excuse is jaggery is not sugar and therefore I will eat more of it, is a recipe for disaster. And likewise, I think people want to optimize it down to, I will not eat any maida, I will not eat root vegetables, I will not eat that. No, I think it's better often to eat a little bit of everything. So that way, in that, I guess one of those things ends up being bad. It's largely simply by percentage. The impact of that is actually going to be much less, and your body's ability to recover from it. I think, a lot of these lessons are so similar, which kind of, I think, a lot of very interesting insights and I think you did cover a fair bit of the reasons for why my next question was, which is to why it's not a great idea for average people to sit and play the stock market on a daily basis. And as you rightly said, sometimes just, even there, sometimes just the index funds will probably, perform way better than you trying to, do all of this. And sometimes, and as research has shown, they often perform better than even experts sitting and trying to do day trading, even on Wall Street and so on. I think the whole investing outside India also was a very insightful thing that I learned. And I think I need to sort of look at that. So one thing that you kind of spoke about, risk appetite. So you spoke about, obviously, ultra conservative, you just put money in FD. And as you said, it's just barely going to match up with inflation. And knowing the current conditions, there's a war on and there's, impacts of climate change and all of that, I think that's simply not good enough. And so clearly, I think the normal ranges you spoke about 10 to 11% returns, nominal economic growth, looking at how India has been growing and so on, right? So these two are clear, right? So when you start thinking about higher levels of risk, in a sense that how should I understand my own risk appetite? Is it just a gut feeling? Because I have a feeling, somehow gut feeling about what is my risk appetite is often not a very scientific way to really understand my risk appetite. Or am I just assuming that I'm less risky, less risk averse? Or I'm sure, is there a mathematical way of also arriving at this, right? Maybe I should arrive at my own risk appetite by really first modeling my own finances, modeling, what kind of emergency risk I have. Do I have elderly parents with medical conditions? Do I have a upcoming child's education? So I'm assuming all of those things have to somehow factor in even understanding your own, sort of risk appetite, right? So how would you go about thinking about that?
Yeah, I think risk has only two questions. Can you take risk and must you take risk? There are only two. And when I say can you take risk, it's about the ability and the inclination. And the concept of must you take risk is, if you need the liquidity in the really short term, you should not take risk. You must not take that risk. And therefore, the answer to must you take risk is no. If you need something in the next 2 years, if I take a risk, it's a lottery. And lotteries are always not good things, because you can lose a lot of money before you go in. The question to can you take risk is behavioral and personal. A lot of studies have been done on this, and why people have different risk appetites largely goes to context, upbringing, thought process. Most of us who have been brought up with this, money is this external thing and you really work hard for your money, we hate losing. We've all been, to be honest, most of us study in these till 11, 12 standard, coming in the top 10% of our class, go to engineering colleges, don't fail a single year. Then you come out and you look at the stock market, you will make money 50% of the time. That means you choose 10 stocks, 5 stocks will lose money, 5 stocks will make money. Whether it's the Nifty or it's the fancy stock picker that you've seen, nobody gets much better than that in the long term. Even Warren Buffett is like roughly, half. But the point is, when he makes
coin
money,
flip, essentially, right?
It's a coin flip.
Yeah.
It is, and it's true for even the best investors. The difference in the best versus the worst is that people who make lots of money from their winners and lose less money on their losers. That's effectively how most people tend to make money. In a fixed deposit kind of scenario, it's the exact opposite, where you say, I will make less money, but I will make it guaranteed. Almost every fixed deposit I make, I will make money. Once in a while, maybe once in 15 years, I'll lose some money, but otherwise I'm okay. This is a coin flip. So this risk appetite is really on which side of this chain do you want to be. The venture in capital investors, they know that out of 10 companies, 9 will fail. 1 will give you 100x return. That's enough. So if I invest 10 rupees in every company, and 1 gives me 100x return, I've earned 1,000 rupees off of 1. Whereas I've invested only 100 rupees in total. So I've got myself a 10x return, not 100x, but 10x, even if 9 fail. They're on the extreme risk side of the spectrum. Can you take risk is just simply about which side of the spectrum you lie. It's like me telling you, if you're a person with a pacemaker, a heart disease, or a small child, pregnant woman, don't get onto a roller coaster because it's bad for you. This is must you take risk? No. But if you're a person who does not have all these problems, you won't know unless you sit on that roller coaster whether you can take it or not, right? So you're going to have to take that risk at least once to figure out if this risk is for you. So everybody needs to try once you don't have these liquidity problems, or you at least know that mentally you're okay. Can you take that risk? Is you have to plunge in, say, well, this risk is too much for me, I can't handle it. I would rather be in non-volatile kind of assets, and therefore you move in. The smartest people over time, and everybody can get this smart, figure out the level of risks that work for them. There's a guy called Markowitz, I think. He got a Nobel Prize for this concept of figuring out exactly how much you should have in risk and how much you should have in non-risk. They asked him how you invest your money. He said, boss, all that shit is too complicated. I put 50% in fixed income, 50% in equity, and that's it. So even the smartest investors figured out it's not worth spending too much time on to figure out how much. So if you don't know the answer to how much risk you can take, put half your money in risk, half your money in non-risk, watch it for a few years, and after a while you'll find out if you can take that risk behaviorally or not. And if you're not, then just take lesser risk. That means shift to 70% fixed income, 30% equity, or even 100% fixed income if that suits you. So your risk appetite is largely something you discover like you say, in the end, the school of hard knocks. That's what teaches you whether your risk appetite, whether you have a risk appetite or not. And mathematical measures of it, I could make you. I mean, if I told you that I'll give you 100 rupees right now, no question asked, and then you flip a coin, and if you hit tails, I get the 100 rupees back, and if it hit heads, you get to keep that 100 rupees. This would somehow make you feel a lot worse about flipping that coin than if I told you I have 100 rupees, you flip a coin, if you hit heads, I'll give you the 100. So that ownership of that 100 made you feel miserable about losing it, although you got it for free in the first place. A lot of times this behavioral problem exists in stock markets as well. So whatever money you make, you think it's yours by right. Although I told you 11%, last 2 years have been 30%, on average, or maybe 20% on average for the last 2 years. It's much more than economic growth. If we gave away 8% this year, it would be perfectly normal, except all of us who are in the market today would hate it, simply because we gave back some of our returns. This is risk appetite. And if you don't go through it at least once, you should before you figure out whether you're a risk taker or not.
I think it's really, I think you've made something clear that I've always been really confused about. And I was reading this book recently called How Not to Be Wrong. Okay, it's by Jordan Ellenberg. He's a mathematician, right? And he kind of, there's one particularly brilliant, this thing, he's called the Baltimore con. He calls it the Baltimore stockbroker con, right? It's basically a financial advisor who has his product is a newsletter that tells you what stocks to pick and so on, right? And essentially, first 10, tips are free. And then after that, there's some sort of you have to pay and so on. And then some people realize that they've got these 10 tips that are spot on, 10 picks that were like making money, right? They're like, oh, wow, this is amazing. And they like throw a ton of money at this guy and, and so on. But the way that company is actually set up is that they pick every combination and send it to 10,000 people. And so simple law of large numbers essentially is that at the likelihood that a bunch of people, at least 10 people, will get 10 correct picks is near 100%. And what you don't know is that 9,000 people got bad advice. Okay, and I think it's really, I think it's. I'm quite certain that I think most of us, right, very very small number of people like you, for instance, who are innately able to somehow catch these fallacies that often exist in this world, in the world of finance. And that I think most people are susceptible to those fallacies. And in a sense, it's weird. I think it's the same set of fallacies that operate in how we think about nutrition, how we think about cook, how we think about politics, how we think about who to vote for. It's the same set of fallacies, but it just manifests itself. And except that when it comes to money, I think, sometimes the stakes seems higher because, but I would argue the stakes are pretty high in food because I think they have long-term health consequences, right? Which you don't realize now, right? When you're young, and only as you grow older and you realize that, oh no, I think I'm about 5 years away from arthritis and, heart disease and blood pressure, and so on. I think, it's really interesting. So my last couple of questions. So one is obviously, again, as an IT guy and someone who is at the intersection of both design as well as, development of software and so on. I am someone who looks at usability and who looks at tools all the time, right? And in general, most software tools are disappointing in their user experience. And in a sense, and particularly in finance, they seem egregiously terrible. And it's just like I'm still yet to find a tool that kind of gives me a really simple, easy, comprehensive view of my finances. And there have been several attempts at it. There have been some startup apps that I have installed, which seemingly quite nice. They gave me a nice UX, nice. It looked very nice. And so on. They kind of said, how much is your mutual funds currently worth? What's your, etc. Lots of stuff, including the value of your house and all those kinds of things, and so on. But ultimately, they ended up, just spamming me with, here's how personal loan you should take, here's insurance you should buy, and then it kind of becomes I think the incentives are wrong. So I still truly believe there is a space for a product that truly makes life simple in the sense of here's where your money is, right? And here's where it should be in some point of time, etc., etc. I'm not even saying it needs to tell you what to do. That's obviously far complex. That needs advisory, but at least a status quo tool. Do you what do you think? Do you think are there tools upcoming? Do you think are you going to build something?
There's a good, and we'd love to build something. And in fact, a lot of work going on that. But here's the interesting part of this. The problem, so there are only two kinds of people who build software for the financial world: geeks and financial people. Both of them focus on the wrong thing. The financial people want to get as much information to you as possible, which means they'll flood the screen with numbers and charts and fancy little gimmicks, which make no sense. They will show you your asset allocation between equity and debt, as if this is the most important part of your life at this point. So, and front on and center. And you're like, dude, wait. There's a lot. I just want to know, a certain set of things, and am I in the right track or not? The geeks build fancy features. No offense to geeks, and perhaps I'm one myself. I like to see numbers change on the screen, right? Whenever the stock prices change, it turns from red to green. The faster you can change it, and this is the 10-minute delivery concept, except it's 10 microseconds in the financial world, which is everybody's fighting for that 10 microseconds.
The geek will focus on the animation of the pie chart. And
exactly.
So,
so look at it, it's fantastic, but what does it tell me? Nothing. So the problem is you get tools that are either fantastic on design and completely waste on usability, or great on information but way too bad on usability. So you end up with very less usable solution. So if you can forgive the usability, there's a product called mProfit, and although I know some of the people in there and I like them, it's a company called mProfit that has built a fairly decent across multiple asset classes kind of. It means if you have house, real estate, gold, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, everything, you put it in one place, it kind of gives you a report. Now, not very good looking, in fact not very malleable as well, and in no way does it tell you the answers to the question that I told you earlier, which is, are you hygiene? Do you have enough hygiene? Do you have enough saved for your retirement? And how much money is left over so that you can spend properly? Nobody currently tells you all these answers to these questions, unfortunately.
Holy grail, to be honest. As I work in IT, and I have met with banks who have asked the likes of TCS and all these other companies so many times in the past that we all have to work together to build that magic app. It has never happened.
Yes,
every version of this, either it's launched with great. My own ICICI has launched several iterations of this. Okay, every iteration of that is like, no, it's missing something, or at some level it doesn't work.
Sometimes it doesn't even pass your level 1 feeling, right? It's almost like I need to go beyond the wow, it looks good, nice colors, to I would like to come back to this every few days or every week and just figure out what my life is. Just tell me what I need to know. Just tell me what I need to know doesn't happen, because they want to sell you a product. They want to increase engagement. So can I make you open the app every day? Why? Why does everybody want to see their net worth on an everyday basis? Like, what will happen? But no, honestly, I say that and I open my Excel sheet once a week, which is of no use to me, but because nothing's going to change on a weekly basis, but I still do it.
No, in fact, my advisor in fact said, 2 reasons why you should not check your real-time view more than once in 6 months. Okay,
yes.
So don't do that. Second thing is that he also said that our app is just so terrible that you wouldn't come once in 6 months.
That's how they're trying to make sure that you don't. And we wanted to actually build an app that rewards people that doesn't open their accounts once.
Hostile design.
Hostile design. Yeah, it's almost like you won a scratch card because you didn't open your app for the last 3 days. So it's fascinating that you're saying this, because it's been something that's we've been also looking to try and solve. But mProfit is the only thing that I found is fairly decent. I don't know if there are many others that I can actually recommend. Many of the others come with a problem of they will send an RM and they'll sell you a personal loan, and then it's finished. So plus you don't want people knowing, random people knowing exactly how much you're worth. That privacy concept is simply
correct, yes.
weird.
And also, plus the weakness of many of these other downstream
Correct.
Selling of data is also a problem, right? Suddenly, all of a sudden, somebody somewhere is trying to sell me a loan, and or say that, oh, by the way, you have this housing loan here. Why don't you move it to this bank? I said, how did you even know, right? And it's just crazy, right? In fact, I did not even know that some few years back that some vehicle loan I had was transferred to another bank. It happened behind the scenes. I didn't even know, right? And these things keep happening. And then I am suddenly spammed by a new bank. I was like, I've never transacted with this bank. Then I realized, oh, by the way, this company that I originally took it with has, sold all of their stuff to, and it's just,
Yeah, no, I mean, the other thing that happens is fraud, where they call you and they tell you we're working in your best interest. Just give us that OTP you got, no, please. And then, like my mother, I've forbidden her from giving OTP to anybody. I'm
Exactly.
like, even if it's a cop who's standing with a known badge in front of your face, you will call me and I will give the OTP to whoever has to be required, because but it's unfortunate, but we don't go after these people quite as much. And perhaps
my mother worked in Canara Bank, and for 30 years, and I'm like, no, you will not have Paytm on your phone. You will not have UPI on your phone. In fact, anything, OTP will come to my phone number. So no OTP will come to your phone number, because I know so many of her peers who have been, people have stolen money from Paytm. Okay, by basically sending them a pay request as opposed to a request, and they don't know the difference, right? And they just sent money to someone, right? And they have no clue.
It's just sad, but that's the thing that I would say. I think the tools and software should actually try and protect you from this kind of stuff.
It's made life more complicated. It's the sort of the larger philosophical sense that somehow we are less aware, have insights about what is going on in the world, in a world with social media, than in a world where you got your news only about half an hour every day night. Because somebody summarized it, somebody curated it, and that was the only time you consumed that news. And now you're in this torrent of information that you don't know what is accurate, what is fake, what is politically motivated, and what is opinion, right? And I think it applies to pretty much everywhere, right? And I think it's harder to choose a product on an Amazon or somewhere else than if you only had about 3 or 4 choices and so on. I think the tyranny of choice, and I think at the same time it is always good for there to be more choices. But I think the tools in the UX to make it easy for people to process a multitude of choices. I don't want the choices to go away, but I want us to be able to have exposure to those choices in a more meaningful sort of, shall we say, carefully sort of curated discovery rather than just dump everything at you, right, kind of way. And that often is the issue with a lot of these financial tools as well. So it brings me to my sort of last question. I think you spoke about lottery, we spoke about risk, and it's only fair that we end our question with something that's on everybody's heads right now: crypto, right? So don't have to get too much into it, but your broad thoughts, is it like yes or no? What do you think?
Very, very, very strongly no. And I'll tell you why. I think so it's the problem that I have with crypto, and I'm a tech person. I love the fact that tech is able to build its own currency. But I do feel that sometimes we're reinventing the financial world and the same scams that the financial world had to go through, which is why the regulations are the way they are. So the same scams are coming back in the crypto world, and nobody's doing anything to stop them. And
they haven't designed for it. That's the really terrible part, right? Something that has taken us 100 years to design in a non-computing analog world to prevent against this kind of fraud. You would think the digital world would prevent against it. No. Right, it's again poorly designed. Yeah,
poorly designed. It's also it's a speculative instrument, so it's like that trading thing that you should do if you're a trader and therefore earn a lot of money out of it. But that requires a lot of skill and the understanding of frauds and all that stuff. But can you go back a little bit and say, well, can I use this as a currency? El Salvador tried it. A year after it has tried it, somebody went to El Salvador and tried to use Bitcoin to pay. Everybody said, just give me dollars, yeah, please. So we're like, why? Like, no, that shit does take too much time. It doesn't know. I don't know what happens. It keeps losing value. Anything I buy anyway is priced in dollars. Why are you paying me in bloody Bitcoin? He tried to pay someone in a restaurant who was very enthused about this thing. He had to pay twice on this Lightning app that this was not Lightning, obviously.
There's nothing Lightning about crypto settlements.
Yes. There is a Lightning network which is supposed to be lightning. I mean, I suppose for them, lightning means 10 minutes.
Few hours or something. Yeah.
So they did this thing twice. It was supposedly gone from his account to this the person who ran the restaurant, but she didn't receive it. So he paid in regular dollars and got to know 2 hours later that his money was debited thrice. Twice from the Bitcoin thing and once from his pocket because he paid dollars. Now, if you can't use it as a currency, I mean, after a year, after 15 years after it has actually started, or 12 years after it has actually started, and people said it would be a great currency, I think there's something fundamentally wrong with it per se. And okay, let's not call it a currency. Let's say you want to save for your longer term using crypto. Think about the fact that if it were a currency, the countries that have currencies also have guns. The reason they have currencies is that they have guns. They have the ability to protect themselves and protect their rights and so on. Like that. Bitcoin does not have any of that. So if it were to threaten any country that had guns, those guns would be used against you. It's like in a time of extreme crisis, you go to gold, they say. But in a time of even more extreme crisis, you go to guns because guns can be used to steal gold. So at some point, Bitcoin does not solve for this beyond the civilized society kind of mechanism. We're finding that out in Ukraine as well. More importantly, it's an unregulated instrument, which means when you lose money, and I say when, not if, more likely you will at some point.
Yes.
When you lose money, nobody will come to protect you, and that losing of money can be because the market fell, which is perfectly fair, or because someone stole coins from your wallet, which is unfair, but you can't even go to a cop to complain because that's what the Bitcoin world tells you. Oh, we are free from any government. Somebody asked him, well, what happens if somebody steals your coins? Well, you can file a police report. Wait. You want a police officer in a system that requires no police officers, that said we surpass all governments in the first place. So if the answer is in the end, you're just a piggybacking on top of a regular legal system to kind of trying to help you, at some point in time, these scams will come back to bite you. So to the general public, I would generally say, if you have people selling you ads, pushing you things like, oh, great returns, more than this economic growth thing, it is a scam. So for the most part, crypto tends to become a big fad scam. Like the Amway guy will come and tell you that if you leave your job and sell soap, you can be a free man or woman, and almost never are they free. So I think the same thing is with crypto. You can buy it, and all probability you're going to end up with disappointment.
Yeah, I think there was again, I committed purely from the tech side, right? And then there's this fascinating video that I want people to watch. There's this amazingly hilarious professor at Harvard Business School, erstwhile Microsoft security researcher and all that. Okay, his name is James Mickens. He's the funniest. He makes some of the most insightful videos about cybersecurity in general. If you're someone who's interested in scams and these kinds of things, I think he's just hilarious, right? And he has this video called "Blockchains Are a Bad Idea." Okay, so again, he comes at it from the point of view that all the problems blockchain is attempting to solve are all things that have been solved with better and more efficient technologies and analog methods. And blockchain is essentially a poorer, terrible solution to exactly the same problem. Without essentially saying that, look, there may be use cases for blockchain that are absolutely brilliant, and so on. But not the ones that it is being used for right now. And yeah, I think, it's a classic case of it's a technology, it's a solution in search of a problem. And then in those situations, you're almost always going to be sold some snake oil. Even if there is a small percentage of chance that there may be something useful in it, you're going to have to go through a ton of snake oil before you get to whatever that useful thing is. Yeah.
I think in this business, you should sell. So in the search for gold, the people who made money were the people who sold pickaxes. So if you can find a way to sell pickaxes to people looking to buy crypto, then do it. Otherwise, I would say just avoid the whole space altogether.
Absolutely. I think I honestly, Deepak, I think I've taken about 4 pages of notes. I think
awesome.
Maybe I should try and digitize this, and then share it. And I think it's I've learned more in the time that we spoke than from any other finance person. And I think you have a way of simplifying it using metaphors that people are able to identify with. I think that's a very powerful skill. I really think both of us should get together and go pitch to schools that we should create a actually not even schools. I was actually thinking first 3 years of people who join jobs, right? That's the time when people actually need to understand how to cook and eat healthily and how to think about money in healthy way. Both of these together, I think, is a great combination.
Yeah,
So,
the wealth and health. I mean, you're
wealth and health, yeah.
Yeah, that's it's a great idea. We'd love to coordinate on
Yeah,
that.
we should do that.
And I
Yes.
should say the same here. I did not know. I mean, I have to replay these recordings because I didn't take any notes, and I'm like, I need to go back and read everything that you just
No, I'm
said.
sure. I think since we have the full recording, I'm probably going to, listen to that. I know our editor's going to have a tough time. I think we've been at it for about almost
3 hours, man. Wow.
3 hours 45 minutes. This is Amit Verma territory, actually. Yes.
Great,
Yeah, so
brilliant.
I think, yes.
It was great.
Good.
Ashok, I think it was brilliant to speak, and thanks for all the time that you've put in. Thanks again, and thanks to everyone for listening. It's been a long, very interesting podcast, and I think much more will come. We'll link to a few more things in the show notes as well. And
Yes.
thanks again, Ashok, for joining in.
Super.